Welcome to boring pastimes, where history slows down, the details linger, and forgotten stories unfold in quiet tones. Tonight, we wander through the quieter corridors of the past, where daily rituals, hidden figures, and overlooked lives shaped the world in subtle ways. Settle in, let your mind drift, and allow the slower pace of history to guide you toward rest. Story 1. The Quiet Walls of St. Lazarus. Foundations of medieval leper houses. When you think about the Middle Ages, you might imagine knights in armor, bustling marketplaces, or illuminated manuscripts glowing in candlelight. Yet, behind those images lay quieter, more unsettling realities. One of these was the slow spread of a disease that would shape how towns, cities, and even entire kingdoms organized their landscapes. Leprosy, or Hansen's disease as it is now known, was not new to Europe when the medieval period began. Mentions of it stretched back to antiquity. The Bible itself recorded descriptions of skin conditions under the broad and fearful word lepra, though the exact medical reality was often different from what modern medicine now identifies as leprosy. By the 11th and 12th centuries, however, chronic cases of disfiguring skin disease that caused numbness, ulcers, and deformities began to be recognized in increasing numbers across Europe. To the medieval mind, leprosy was more than just an illness. It was a visible mark of separation. Unlike fevers or invisible infections, this disease carried signs that neighbors could see, and that the sick themselves could not hide: thickened skin, ulcerations, and sometimes the loss of fingers, toes, or even the ability to feel pain. The body itself became a kind of signal to others, and with it came fear. In towns from France to England, from the German lands to the Iberian Peninsula, reports of leprosy increased steadily through the 12th century. Historians debate whether the rise was due to an actual epidemic or whether medieval society was simply becoming more systematic in naming and identifying the disease. Either way, the perception of an increase was enough to change daily life. Communities began to consider how to live with, or apart from, those afflicted. You might imagine that people would have hidden such illness, but the cultural reality of the Middle Ages made that difficult. Public rituals often demanded that lepers declare themselves. In some regions, they were required to wear special clothing, drab tunics, or distinctive hoods, and carry small wooden clappers or rattles to signal their presence. These rules, however, did not appear overnight. They grew gradually out of a climate of fear mixed with religious interpretation. The church played a central role in shaping this perception. Illness, especially chronic illness, was often read as a spiritual sign. Leprosy became linked with sin, sometimes thought to be punishment from God, though paradoxically, lepers were also viewed as uniquely close to Christ, whose suffering they mirrored. This double meaning, cursed yet holy, meant that medieval communities could not simply reject lepers outright. Instead, they created spaces for them, and so, slowly, the institution of the leprosarium, or leper house, emerged. These were not hospitals in the modern sense, nor were they prisons, though they carried elements of both. They were places where people with leprosy might live apart from the healthy, under certain rules and routines. By the 13th century, almost every large European town had at least one such institution, often placed just beyond the city walls, by a roadside or near a river crossing, where travelers could see them but townsfolk could feel they were safely outside the community's core. The most common name for these institutions was linked to Saint Lazarus, the biblical figure raised from the dead. Lazarus, often conflated with the beggar from Christ's parable, who suffered sores and sat at the rich man's gate, became the patron saint of lepers. The Order of Saint Lazarus, founded during the Crusades, gave further momentum to this connection, establishing leper houses across Europe under his name. When you see a medieval record mentioning St. Lazarus' house, it was almost certainly a leprosarium. But what were these places like in their beginnings? The earliest leper houses were modest, often consisting of just a small chapel and a handful of timber or stone buildings. They relied heavily on donations from townsfolk, nobles, and sometimes kings. Documents survive listing gifts of land, food, or coin for the souls of the departed, or for the comfort of the afflicted. Pattern of charitable giving reflected the belief that supporting lepers brought spiritual merit. The foundations of these institutions reveal something important about medieval society. Fear was never completely separated from compassion. Towns did not want the sick wandering freely through marketplaces, yet they also did not wish to abandon them entirely. Instead, leper houses stood at the threshold between inclusion and exclusion, charity and segregation. In France, records show that by the 13th century, there were hundreds of leprosaria, many with detailed sets of rules. In England, historians estimate that between 500 and 1,000 such houses existed at their peak. Germany, too, maintained countless small leper houses on the edges of towns. The sheer number suggests how widespread the response had become. Life inside these institutions, however, was another matter entirely. Were they places of quiet dignity or of silent despair? To answer that, we must look more closely at their rules, their routines, and the daily rhythms of those who lived behind their walls. Would you like me to continue to Section 2 of Story 1, the first leprosaria, how towns built walls of isolation? When you picture a medieval leper house, you might imagine a kind of hospital, with beds in long halls and attendants moving quietly among the sick. The reality, however, was both simpler and stranger. A leprosarium was not designed primarily for treatment. It was not built to cure. Instead, it was designed to contain, to create boundaries in stone, wood, and ritual that separated lepers from the healthy world outside in its earliest form. A leprosarium usually grew from a chapel. The church building, often dedicated to Saint Lazarus or Saint Mary Magdalene, stood at the center of the site. Around it, small dwellings were constructed. These might be huts of timber and thatch, or modest stone cottages, if the community had enough wealth. Paths connected the dwellings to the chapel, and sometimes to a communal hall where food was distributed. The location of these leper houses was carefully chosen. They were rarely built in the center of town. Instead, they stood along the main roads leading in and out of settlements. This placement served two purposes. First, it removed the lepers from daily urban life, protecting townsfolk from contact. Second, it placed them where travelers might see them and give alms. The sight of a leper colony at the roadside was a reminder of mortality and sin, and many passers-by felt compelled to offer food, coins, or clothing. legal and social customs reinforced this separation. In some regions, lepers underwent a ritual that symbolically declared them dead to the world. Records describe ceremonies in which a priest would pronounce a kind of funeral service over the afflicted person. They were not physically dead, but spiritually and socially, they were treated as if their old life had ended. Afterward, they would be guided to their new residence in the leper house, where they would live under new rules. The walls of these institutions, whether literal or symbolic, defined the rhythm of life inside. Some leper houses were enclosed by fences or walls, limiting contact with the outside world. Others relied on custom rather than masonry, with townsfolk simply avoiding the site and lepers rarely venturing beyond it. Either way, the effect was the same. The colony was an island, connected to the wider world by only a few pathways. Charters and statutes tell us much about how these early institutions functioned. In some English towns, lepers were granted rights to gather wood from certain forests or to receive annual donations of grain. Wealthy patrons might endow a leper house with farmland, the rents from which sustained the community. At the same time, restrictions were clear. Lepers were often forbidden from entering markets, mills, or churches in town. If they wished to attend Mass, it was usually in their own chapel, with the healthy watching from a distance. Architecture reinforced this. Many leper chapels had small side windows, sometimes called leper squints, through which the sick could glimpse the altar without mingling with the congregation. This design reflected the broader principle, inclusion at a distance. Lepers could share in the rites of the church, but only through controlled openings, both physical and social. The Order of St. Lazarus, founded during the Crusades, played a crucial role in spreading this model. Originally created to care for leprous knights in the Holy Land, the order established houses across Europe. These institutions followed a semi-monastic structure, with rules for prayer, silence, and obedience. Not every leper house belonged to the order, but the Lazarites set a pattern that many local communities imitated. Their green cross symbol, often displayed on buildings or documents, became a recognizable mark of such institutions. It would be misleading to imagine that every leprosarium was large or well organized. Some were little more than a hut and a chapel. Others, like those near major cities, grew into substantial complexes with dozens of residents. The famous leper house at Harbledown, near Canterbury in England, became well known to pilgrims traveling to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Passing pilgrims often dropped coins or gifts as they went by, supporting the community through their generosity. Rules for daily life varied but usually shared a common pattern. Lepers were to live apart, eat simple food, and avoid scandalous behavior. Marriage was sometimes permitted, though many houses discouraged it. Residents might tend small gardens, raise animals, or weave cloth. These activities were not simply economic, but symbolic. They filled the long hours of isolation with work that gave rhythm to the days despite the walls and rules. Leper houses were not entirely cut off. Towns remained responsible for their upkeep, and healthy visitors sometimes entered to deliver food, clothing, or medical care. In some regions, physicians and surgeons were paid to attend the sick, though their treatments, ointments, baths, or prayers offered little real cure. Contact was always cautious, sometimes limited to passing objects through barriers or leaving goods at designated spots. The presence of a leprosarium also shaped how communities thought about their boundaries. A town with such a colony declared, by its very geography, where danger began and ended. The leper house at the edge of the road became a marker. This is where sickness dwells. This is where charity is owed. And this is where the healthy world stops. Documents reveal how seriously these boundaries were taken. In some places, lepers were forbidden to drink from common wells, to grind their grain at town mills, or to touch goods in the marketplace. In others, they were required to carry signs of their status, a wooden clapper, a bell, or a distinctive garment. The sound of a clapper rattling in the distance told villagers to make way. Silence was broken only by the enforced noise of exclusion, and yet, paradoxically, these institutions also brought a form of belonging. Within the walls of a leper house, residents shared a community of their own. They prayed together, ate together, and endured the long years of illness together. In a society that prized order and hierarchy, the leprosarium gave even the excluded a kind of place, not within the market square or the guild hall, but within a recognized, if marginal, structure. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the network of leper houses stretched across Europe, from small rural hamlets to bustling towns. Each stood as a quiet testimony to the balance medieval society struck between fear and charity, exclusion and care. But what was it like to live inside, day after day, year after year? What routines shaped the hours, and how did lepers themselves understand their condition and their place in the world? These questions lead us beyond the walls themselves, into the lived experience of those who inhabited them. If you close your eyes and imagine a leper house in the early 13th century, you might picture silence. And that image would not be wrong. Daily life inside these institutions was slow, repetitive, and shaped by rules designed as much for spiritual order as for physical health. In many ways, the routines mirrored those of monasteries, and in some places, the same monastic orders that cared for the sick also administered the leprosaria. The rules that governed these communities often survive in written form. Some came from bishops who set down statutes for leper houses in their dioceses. Others were modeled directly on monastic codes adapted for a lay population. They prescribed not only prayer, but also silence, humility, and obedience. In many houses, residents rose at set hours for prayers in the chapel. The rhythm of the liturgical year, Advent, Lent, Easter, and the saints' feast days gave shape to the passing seasons. Meals, too, were often communal, though simple. Bread, pottage, and occasionally fish or meat were staples. Donations from townspeople supplemented these basics, but food was always modest. Some leper houses had their own farmland, and residents worked the fields or tended gardens. Herbs were especially important, both for cooking and for the preparation of medicinal remedies. Monks and nuns, when present, oversaw the distribution of food and the care of the sick. Clothing marked out the leper's identity. In many regions, statutes required them to wear plain, dull garments. Hoods often concealed disfigurements, but the clothing also served as a uniform, signaling to outsiders who they were. Along with the sound of the clapper, these garments reminded both the lepers themselves and the healthy world that they belonged to a separate category. Yet within the leper house, These external marks may have carried less sting. Among others who shared the same condition, there was no need to hide. In this sense, the colony provided not just segregation, but solidarity. Accounts from visitors sometimes note the sense of order and peace they found in these communities. Though we must remember that such observers often viewed lepers through the lens of charity rather than lived experience. Rules extended to contact with outsiders. Some houses forbade residents from leaving the grounds without permission. Others allowed limited interaction, especially for begging or collecting alms. In regions where lepers were permitted to beg, their clappers or bells became tools not only of warning but of appeal. A rattle at the roadside was both a signal of exclusion and a request for compassion. Religious life was central. The chapel stood at the heart of the colony, and Mass was celebrated regularly. Confession and penance were emphasized, for many believed that leprosy symbolized sin itself. In some sermons, lepers were praised as imitators of Christ's suffering. This dual perception, cursed and blessed, gave spiritual meaning to their condition. For the afflicted, faith offered a framework in which their suffering was not meaningless but connected to a larger story of salvation. Monks or priests who served these houses often lived according to their own rules of discipline. In some cases, entire communities of religious orders devoted themselves to the care of lepers, especially the Order of Saint Lazarus. Their role was not only to provide spiritual guidance, but also to maintain the physical routines, ensuring food supplies, administering property, and enforcing rules. The monotony of life could be profound. Days stretched on with few changes. Work in the gardens, prayers in the chapel, and meals in the hall were the central anchors of time. Sickness progressed slowly, and for many years were spent in a cycle of decline. Yet within this monotony, small variations mattered. The arrival of a gift from a patron, the visit of a bishop, or the celebration of a feast day might break the stillness. Social structures existed even within the colonies. In some larger leprosaria, there were officers among the residents, wardens, treasurers, or elected representatives who managed daily affairs. This gave a degree of autonomy to the lepers themselves, allowing them to govern their own community within the constraints imposed by society. Such arrangements reveal a complexity often overlooked. These were not simply prisons, but functioning communities with internal order. There was, however, always the awareness of separation. A leper's family, if they visited at all, did so with caution. Contact was minimal, sometimes restricted to speaking across a barrier or leaving goods at a designated place. The sense of being both alive and cut off must have weighed heavily. Some records speak of lepers who escaped or who resisted confinement. Though these cases appear rare, most seem to have accepted their place, shaped by both necessity and faith over time. Many leper houses accumulated property and wealth. Endowments of land allowed them to generate income, and donations from the faithful continued to sustain them. This wealth sometimes led to tensions, as towns or nobles sought to control the resources. Charters and lawsuits show disputes over boundaries, rents, and rights. Even in isolation, the leprosaria remained entangled with the economic and legal world outside their walls. It is easy to imagine these communities fading into obscurity. But for centuries, They stood as visible markers of medieval life. Travelers on the road to a great cathedral might pass by a St. Lazarus house, hearing the faint sound of clappers or bells. Pilgrims might pause to drop a coin or food. The image of lepers gathered at the edge of the road became a familiar sight, woven into the fabric of medieval experience. What is striking when we step back is how ordinary it all became. The rules, the routines, the slow pace of days, these were not exceptional, but expected. For medieval society, leper houses were simply part of the landscape, as common as mills or monasteries. They embodied a balance between fear and duty, between exclusion and care. And yet, behind those quiet walls, individuals lived entire lives. They woke, worked, prayed, and died within the boundaries society had drawn for them. Their names rarely survive, but their presence shaped the towns and roads of Europe for centuries. As the Middle Ages wore on, new diseases and crises would challenge this system. The arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century shifted attention and resources, and the number of leper houses began to decline. But before we reach that point, we must first ask, what was it like for the individual leper? Not just to live in a house of rules, but to move through each hour of the day, carrying the signs of exclusion even outside the walls. Story 2. The sound of the clapper. Daily life of a medieval leper. You are not simply yourself. You are marked. Every stitch of clothing on your body, every sound you are required to make, tells the world who you are before you even speak. To live as a leper in the Middle Ages was to carry not only the burden of illness, but also the constant weight of symbols that reminded both you and everyone else of your status. The medieval world thrived on distinctions. Guilds had their badges, monks wore their habits, and knights carried their coats of arms. Symbols communicated identity and rank, and in the case of lepers, they communicated exclusion. Clothing was one of the most visible signs of this. Records from across Europe show that lepers were often required to wear a particular kind of garment. These clothes were plain, often made from coarse material, and typically dyed in dull or muted colors. The point was not comfort or fashion, but recognition. In some places, statutes required lepers to wear a hood with a long front piece that shaded the face. The hood could conceal deformities, but it also served as a mark of difference. In other towns, lepers were ordered to wear gloves, even when not needed for warmth. This rule was rooted in fear of touch, the idea that even the skin of a leper was dangerous. Gloves created a barrier, however thin, between the afflicted and the healthy. Alongside clothing came sound. The most distinctive object carried by medieval lepers was the wooden clapper or rattle. Shaken as they walked, it announced their presence to anyone nearby. Some regions replaced the clapper with a small bell worn on the clothing or carried in hand. The sound of the clapper was more than a warning, it was an obligation. Statutes in French and English towns specifically required lepers to use them whenever they came near healthy people. The sound ensured that no one could claim surprise at an unexpected encounter. The social meaning of these symbols was profound. They made lepers visible, or rather audible, even when they might have wished for invisibility. A healthy townsman could walk quietly through a marketplace, but a leper could not. The clapper was a forced declaration of identity, echoing with each step. It stripped away privacy, turning every walk into a performance of exclusion. Legal codes reinforced these practices. In some towns, lepers were banned from entering markets altogether, except on designated days or at certain hours. When permitted, they were required to remain at a distance from the stalls, sometimes behind a rope or barrier. Food might be placed on the ground or handed across with care, ensuring no direct contact. Coins, too, were often dropped into vessels of water or vinegar, a crude attempt at disinfection. Religious rituals also marked lepers apart. In several regions, when someone was formally identified as having leprosy, they underwent a ceremony known as the leper mass or leper funeral. During this rite, the priest declared them dead to the world. In some versions, the afflicted lay in a grave while earth was sprinkled upon them, symbolizing burial. Afterward, they rose and were led away to their new life of separation. The ritual both dramatized and enforced the idea that a leper was no longer part of ordinary society, daily life outside. The leper house thus involved constant negotiation of boundaries. A trip to the well, a walk along the road, or an attempt to beg for food required the leper to manage symbols and rules. They could not simply move through space like anyone else. They had to move carefully, with clothing and clapper declaring their condition. The world around them responded accordingly, some with fear, some with pity, and some with indifference. This visibility could bring a certain security. Because their identity was so clearly marked, lepers could appeal to charity without suspicion. Townsfolk might fear them, but they also recognized their claim on alms. A coin dropped into a wooden bowl was not just charity. It was a fulfillment of religious duty, for supporting the poor and afflicted was seen as a path to salvation. In this way, the very symbols of exclusion became tools of survival. Yet the rules were strict. A leper who ignored them risked punishment. Documents from Paris and London record cases where lepers were expelled from towns for failing to use their clappers or for mingling too closely with the healthy. Fear of contagion was strong, even though the actual medical transmission of leprosy was poorly understood. The enforcement of rules was less about science and more about maintaining order, boundaries, and reassurance for the healthy population. It is important to recognize that these practices varied across Europe. Not every town enforced the same clothing requirements. Some regions were more lenient, others more severe, but the underlying principle was consistent. To be a leper was to be set apart, not only by illness, but by a web of symbols, laws, and rituals. The psychological weight of this must have been heavy. Imagine carrying a clapper each time you walked, knowing that its sound reminded others of your condition before they even saw your face. Imagine wearing coarse clothes that announced your status in every stitch. The disease disfigured the body, but the rules disfigured the social self. And yet, within this framework, lepers carved out ways to endure. Some embraced the religious meaning given to their condition, seeing themselves as sharing in Christ's suffering. Others relied on the small communities of leper houses for companionship and dignity. In every case, survival required not only endurance of illness, but also adaptation to the endless rules of conduct imposed upon them. As we listen to the echoes of those clappers across medieval roads, one question lingers beyond clothing and sound. What did the daily routines of lepers actually look like? How did they eat, work, and pass the long hours of life within and beyond the walls of their colonies? If you were to step through the gates of a medieval leper colony in the 13th century, you would quickly notice the quiet order of life. The bustle of the town marketplace was absent. Instead, you would find a slower rhythm, one defined by the preparation of meals, the tending of small gardens, and the simple tasks that filled long hours. To understand what it was like to live in such a place, we must look closely at the essentials of survival: food, work, and the management of time. Food was one of the most basic and constant concerns. Lepers, like all people of the Middle Ages, relied heavily on bread. Wheat bread was prized, but in poorer regions, rye or barley loaves were the norm. Alongside bread came pottage, a thick soup made of grains, peas, beans, or vegetables stewed together. Into this might go whatever was available from the gardens or donated by townsfolk: onions, leeks, cabbages, or herbs. On special days, fish or meat might be added, though this was rare. Donations were crucial. Many leper houses had charters granting them yearly gifts of grain, salt, or ale from surrounding communities. Some towns required bakers to provide loaves or butchers to supply portions of meat on set days. Wealthier patrons sometimes sent wine, cheese, or honey. These gifts were not just acts of generosity. They were obligations tied to the belief that supporting lepers helped secure salvation. Thus, food for the colony was both an economic transaction and a spiritual duty. Cooking was often done communally. Some leper houses had a central kitchen where residents or attendants prepared meals for everyone. Others allowed residents to cook in their own small dwellings, though this risked waste and inefficiency. In larger houses, mealtimes followed a fixed schedule, with prayers said before and after eating. Silence during meals was sometimes required, echoing monastic practice. But food was more than sustenance. It was also a marker of inclusion and exclusion. Lepers rarely ate with healthy townsfolk. Instead, they consumed their meals apart, either within their own colony or in designated spaces. Even when attending religious feasts, they often sat separately. The act of eating together, so central to medieval ideas of community, was something lepers could rarely share with the wider society. Work provided another structure to daily life. While severe illness might prevent heavy labor, many lepers were capable of light tasks. Gardening was common. Residents cultivated herbs such as sage, rosemary, or thyme, both for cooking and for simple remedies. They grew vegetables like beans, peas, and onions, which were staples of the medieval diet. Some colonies kept small flocks of chickens or sheep, providing eggs, wool, and occasional meat. Records mention leper houses producing cloth, either for their own use or for trade. Such labor not only provided material goods, but also gave residents purpose. In a world where identity was often tied to work, the craftsman to his guild, the peasant to his field, the ability to labor offered dignity. Even within confinement, some leper houses owned land, worked not by the lepers themselves, but by hired laborers or tenants. The rents from these properties supported the colony. In such cases, residents might oversee or at least be aware of the economic arrangements that sustained them. Charters and account rolls show how carefully these properties were managed. with officials keeping track of income, repairs, and obligations. Even in their isolation, lepers were linked to the wider web of medieval economy. Time in the colony passed slowly. The day was divided by prayer, meals, and small tasks. Morning might begin with mass in the chapel, followed by work in the gardens or workshops. Midday brought the main meal, after which the afternoon stretched with quieter activities, mending clothes, preparing herbs, or resting. Evening prayers closed the day, and darkness settled early in a world without artificial light. Illness shaped these routines. As leprosy progressed, many lost sensation in their hands or feet, making work difficult. Ulcers and infections were common. In such cases, the rhythm of life slowed further, with the sick spending more time in rest or in the care of attendants. Some leper houses employed nurses, often drawn from religious orders, who tended wounds, bathed the infirm, or applied ointments. Treatments were largely palliative rather than curative, soothing the symptoms rather than offering a cure. Festivals punctuated the monotony. Like the rest of medieval society, leper colonies observed the great feasts of the church calendar. Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were celebrated with special meals, extra prayers, and sometimes music. On such days, gifts from patrons might arrive, adding variety to the diet and lifting spirits. For a community where each day resembled the last, these festivals provided rare moments of joy and collective meaning. Contact with the outside world was limited but not absent. Merchants sometimes delivered goods, leaving them at designated spots. Priests or bishops might visit, either to oversee the colony or to perform sacraments. Pilgrims passing by might offer alms at the gates. These interactions were carefully controlled, but they reminded the residents that they were still part of a larger Christian community, even if at its margins. At times, lepers themselves went out into the wider world, especially to beg. The clapper or bell they carried ensured that no one could mistake their presence. Standing by a roadside or at a town's edge, they called out for alms, sometimes reciting set phrases or prayers. Begging was not shameful in this context. It was expected. In giving, the healthy performed a duty, and in receiving, the leper offered them an opportunity for charity. The emotional life of lepers is harder to glimpse, but it surely revolved around endurance. The long hours, the restrictions, and the slow progression of illness must have weighed heavily. Yet, within the colony, friendships formed. Shared meals, prayers, and labor created bonds. For many, the colony was not only a place of exclusion, but also the only community where they were fully accepted. What emerges from all this is a picture, not of despair, but of a quiet, monotonous resilience. Food was shared, work was done, prayers were said, the days repeated, year after year. It was not a life of drama, but it was life sustained by the balance of charity and rules that defined the medieval world. And yet, monotony was not the whole story. Rituals, festivals, and small acts of dignity gave shape to this existence. To understand the full rhythm of life in a leper colony, we must look more closely at those special moments, the ceremonies, the celebrations, and the occasional joys that punctuated the silence. For all its routines of food, work, and prayer, the life of a leper colony was not entirely without variation. Festivals and rituals provided markers in an otherwise flat stretch of time, like faintly lit beacons across a long, dark plain. These moments allowed residents to join, however distantly, in the rhythms of the church and society, and they revealed much about how the medieval world perceived those who lived within such walls. The ritual of exclusion. Every leper's journey into the colony began with a ritual that resembled, in many ways, a funeral, known in some places as the Mass of the Dead. This ceremony marked the point at which the afflicted person left ordinary society behind. The leper was led to the church, where priests intoned prayers over them as though they had already died. In some versions, a clod of earth was placed upon their body, or a funeral pall covered them. The ritual was both terrifying and strangely merciful. It declared to the community that this person was now dead to the world of the healthy. At the same time, it assured the leper that they were not abandoned. They were still alive within the care of the church, set aside but not forgotten. The service ended with the leper being taken to the colony, where their new life, half in the world, half outside it, began. The very objects of daily life carried traces of ritual. The clapper, a simple wooden instrument, was not just a tool but a symbol. When shaken, it warned others to keep distance, yet it also gave the leper a kind of voice. Bells, too, were used, sometimes attached to clothing or carried in hand. These sounds became part of the sonic landscape of medieval towns, faint rattles or chimes that reminded listeners of sin, mortality, and charity. Festivals in the colony within the walls of the colony. The church calendar unfolded in its familiar cycle. Lent brought fasting, Easter brought joy, and Advent led to Christmas. Though separated from the larger community, lepers participated in these rhythms with special services, extra prayers, and, when possible, better meals on Christmas. Leper houses often received gifts from patrons: loaves of white bread, jugs of wine, wheels of cheese, or candles for the chapel. Easter might be marked with processions inside the colony walls, hymns sung in soft voices, or small plays reenacting the resurrection. Saints' days were particularly important, as many colonies were dedicated to a specific patron, Saint Lazarus being the most common, since he was seen as the patron of lepers. In some towns, healthy parishioners processed near the colony on feast days, offering alms or prayers. Though the lepers could not join directly, they witnessed the movement and sound from behind walls or at the edges of fields. In this way, festivals acted as reminders that even the separated were part of a larger Christian body, connected by ritual, if not by touch. Moments of joy. Despite the grim reputation of leper houses, there were moments of celebration. Records speak of weddings between lepers, sometimes solemnized with the blessing of clergy. These unions, though unusual, provided companionship and mutual care. There were also occasions of music, simple songs played on flutes or sung in groups, often during festivals or evenings by the fire. Food itself could become a source of festivity. A gift of fish on a saint's day or a delivery of sweet honey cakes might turn an ordinary meal into an occasion. Ale and wine, when permitted, lifted spirits. For people who lived with monotony and pain, such small pleasures were magnified, remembered for weeks afterward. Separation and quiety. Yet alongside these celebrations, separation remained constant. Lepers were not expected to mingle with townsfolk during festivals. When processions passed by, the afflicted often watched from a distance, barred from entry into the main church or public squares. On Palm Sunday, for example, when parishioners carried branches in procession, lepers might be given their own branches but had to wave them from apart. Unable to join the crowd, this quiet exclusion created a strange duality. The leper was part of the Christian community in faith and ritual, but not in physical presence. They prayed the same prayers, observed the same holy days, but always from behind a boundary. Their lives became living symbols, reminders of sin, suffering, and the need for compassion. The silence of separation was profound. Imagine standing outside the gates of a town, hearing the bells ring for Mass, the choir lifting voices inside, the sound of laughter and chatter spilling from the streets. You are included in spirit, but excluded in body. That tension defined much of the leper's religious life. The hope of pilgrimage for some lepers. Ritual offered not just exclusion, but also a path of hope. Pilgrimage was one such avenue. Though restricted, certain colonies allowed or even encouraged lepers to travel to holy shrines. Carrying their clappers or bells, they walked slowly along roads, stopping at inns or roadside chapels where alms might be given. The shrine of St. James at Compostela, St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, and countless local saints' chapels saw visits from such travelers. Pilgrimage gave meaning to suffering. The long road, the physical pain, the endurance of hardship all mirrored the spiritual journey toward salvation. To see a leper at a shrine was to witness a visible emblem of endurance, reminding the healthy of the fragility of life. Death, and the final ritual death, when it came, was both ordinary and significant. Lepers were often buried within the grounds of the colony, in cemeteries set apart from those of the town. Their funerals were simpler than those of wealthy citizens, but still carried dignity. Prayers were said, earth was placed upon the coffin, and the name of the deceased was remembered. The graveyard of a leper house thus became a record of its community, each burial marking another step in the slow passing of time. Visitors to these cemeteries, often priests or patrons, were reminded of mortality and of the Christian duty to care for the poor and afflicted. The cycle of ritual, from the Mass of the dead at entry to the burial at the end, framed the entire existence of a leper within liturgical rhythm. Living symbols. What makes these rituals and festivals so striking is how they transformed the leper into a symbol to medieval society. The leper was both a sufferer of disease and a living parable, an image of Christ's suffering, a reminder of the wages of sin, and a call to charity. Every clapper rattle, every separate feast, every distant prayer reinforced this symbolism. And yet, for the lepers themselves, these rituals were not only symbolic but personal. They gave shape to days that might otherwise blur into monotony. They offered moments of connection, however faint, to the wider church. They brought joy, dignity, and meaning into lives marked by isolation. The picture that emerges is of a community both cut off and deeply connected, cut off in body, connected in ritual. Their world was marked by silence, yet within that silence were the sounds of bells, prayers, and songs, faint but enduring. To understand the life of a medieval leper, one must step outside the colony walls and into the minds of the townsfolk, the clergy, and the rulers who observed them from a distance. The lepers' existence was shaped as much by how others perceived them as by the disease itself. Their daily lives were not only medical or social experiences, but also performances of meaning projected upon them by a fearful society. Fear of contagion, perhaps the most obvious element of perception, was fear. Medieval people were deeply concerned about the spread of illness, even though they lacked modern knowledge of bacteria or transmission. Leprosy, with its visible marks, lesions on the skin, disfigurement of the face and limbs, seemed to embody contagion itself. Texts from the 12th and 13th centuries describe lepers as unclean or dangerous. Laws often required them to live apart, to use clappers or bells, and to avoid touching food or drink meant for others. Even coins they handled were sometimes placed in vinegar before being accepted. This was less about scientific prevention than about ritualized reassurance. To the healthy, the very act of separation provided a sense of safety. Yet fear was not uniform. In some regions, lepers were seen less as contagious threats and more as spiritual warnings. The disease became a metaphor for sin, and the leper was cast as a living sermon, disfigured on the outside as the sinful soul might be on the inside. This blending of medical anxiety and moral meaning produced a complex and often contradictory attitude. Moral symbolism in medieval sermons frequently used leprosy as an image of vice. Just as leprosy spread silently through the body, sin spread silently through the soul. Just as leprosy left visible marks on the skin, so too did sin leave stains on a person's life. This comparison reinforced the idea that lepers were not just sick, but symbolically charged. For some preachers, this moral imagery justified separation. To avoid lepers was not merely to protect health, but also to distance oneself from the corruption of sin. The visible presence of a leper reminded the healthy to examine their own lives, confess their sins, and repent. Thus, fear of lepers was not only physical, but spiritual. Charity and compassion, yet another strand of perception, emphasized charity. The Gospels urged Christians to care for the sick, feed the hungry, and comfort the afflicted. Lepers, by their visible suffering, provided an opportunity for the healthy to demonstrate compassion. Giving alms to a leper was not only kindness, but also a way of storing spiritual treasure. Patrons often endowed leper hospitals as acts of piety. Kings and nobles left donations in their wills. Towns established funds for the support of colonies, seeing them as necessary institutions of mercy. This charitable perspective did not erase fear, but it reframed it. Lepers were both dangerous and holy, both shunned and sanctified. Suspicion and exclusion, fear and charity coexisted uneasily, but suspicion often tipped the balance. Lepers were sometimes accused of crimes that reflected broader anxieties of medieval society. During outbreaks of plague, for instance, rumors spread that lepers had poisoned wells. In 1321, in France, hysteria led to mass arrests of lepers under accusations of conspiracy. Many were executed or burned, their supposed plots serving as scapegoats for larger social fears. These episodes reveal how lepers, as visibly marked outsiders, could become targets in times of crisis. When societies faced famine, disease, or war, it was easy to project blame onto those already marginalized. The leper's difference, constantly reinforced by clothing, clappers, and legal codes, made them convenient symbols of danger. Daily encounters beyond grand fears and symbolic meanings. There were ordinary encounters between lepers and townsfolk. A woman fetching water might meet a leper begging at the well. A farmer on the road might hear the rattle of a clapper approaching. Children in villages, warned by parents, might run away or, in some cases, throw stones. Such encounters were shaped by local custom. In some towns, lepers were tolerated and even greeted politely. In others, hostility was common. What remained constant was the awareness of difference. Every interaction carried the weight of rules, fears, and expectations. Clergy and theological views, the church itself was divided in its perceptions. On one hand, clerics emphasized compassion, seeing lepers as Christ-like figures whose suffering mirrored the Passion. Some saints, such as Francis of Assisi, deliberately embraced lepers, kissing their hands and serving them food as acts of humility. On the other hand, ecclesiastical authorities enforced separation, sanctioning rituals of exclusion and maintaining leper houses apart from towns. This duality reflected the broader medieval approach to honor lepers as spiritual symbols while keeping them physically apart. The tension was never resolved, only managed. The leper as a mirror of society. When we step back, we see that lepers functioned as a mirror in which medieval society saw its own fears and hopes. They embodied contagion, reminding people of the fragility of health. They symbolized sin, warning of the danger of moral corruption. They invited charity, giving the healthy a chance to demonstrate mercy. They bore suspicion, serving as scapegoats in times of crisis. To live as a leper was to inhabit all these meanings simultaneously, whether one wanted to or not. Each rattle of the clapper echoed not only the presence of illness, but also the layers of meaning society projected onto it. Unresolved question, and yet, beneath all these perceptions, a deeper question remains. Did medieval people truly believe lepers were beyond redemption, or did they see in them a peculiar closeness to God? Was the leper merely feared, or was the leper also revered? When we imagine medieval leper colonies, it is tempting to picture only silence, idleness, and dependence. Yet survival in these places required more than waiting for charity. Behind the walls of leper houses, work continued, modest, humble, and often hidden from the sight of townsfolk. These economies did not flourish like those of great monasteries or bustling guild halls, but they sustained life, preserved dignity, and gave shape to otherwise endless days. Alms, as a foundation, the primary economic support for most colonies, came from alms giving. Medieval society understood charity as a religious duty, and lepers, with their visible suffering, were natural recipients. Townspeople gave coins, food, or clothing, either directly to beggars carrying clappers, or indirectly through donations to hospitals and chapels. Some towns established fixed arrangements, weekly distributions of bread, seasonal gifts of meat, or yearly donations of grain. Patrons, wealthy nobles, merchants, or clergy endowed leper houses with income from land or tithes. A field or vineyard might be granted for the sustenance of the poor. Lepers, its harvest sustaining the colony. Yet alms alone rarely sufficed. Leper houses needed additional income. and residents often worked within their capacity to contribute. Agricultural labor. Many colonies included farmland attached to their grounds. Lepers who were physically able helped tend gardens, orchards, or small fields. They grew beans, onions, and cabbages, simple crops that provided steady sustenance. Some raised chickens or goats, supplementing meals with eggs, milk, and occasional meat. Work was organized communally. Tasks were divided according to strength. One person might carry water, another tend herbs, another watch livestock. Those with severe deformities often contributed in less strenuous ways, such as mending nets or sorting seeds. The rhythm of farming marked the seasons. Spring brought planting, summer demanded weeding, autumn required harvest, and winter called for preserving what had been gathered. These tasks connected lepers to the same agricultural cycles that governed the lives of peasants outside the walls. Even as separation defined their existence, craft and production. Some leper colonies developed modest crafts. Weaving, spinning, and sewing were common, especially since clothing for residents needed constant repair. A few places became known for producing rough textiles, which could be sold or traded for food in certain regions. Lepers worked with leather, tanning hides, stitching shoes, or crafting simple belts. This was practical as well as economic. Footwear was essential for those whose illness affected their feet, and making their own reduced costs. There are also records of leper houses producing candles, either from beeswax or tallow. Candles were always in demand for churches, and even small-scale production provided steady income. These crafts were rarely prestigious, but they allowed colonies to generate goods of value while remaining relatively isolated. Begging as labor for many lepers. Begging was itself a form of work. Carrying a clapper or bell, they walked into towns or along roads, seeking alms from passersby. This was not an entirely passive act. Begging required stamina, patience, and often long hours of standing or walking. It also demanded strategy, choosing the right place, timing, and approach to maximize gifts without provoking hostility. Begging could be seasonal. During Lent, when charity was especially emphasized, lepers often received greater support. On saints' feast days, they might gather near churches, hoping to benefit from the generosity of worshippers. Some colonies even sent representatives, healthier members, capable of walking to collect alms on behalf of all, though degrading in the eyes of many. Begging was framed as legitimate labor in the medieval world. Lepers did not earn wages, but fulfilled a spiritual role. They provided opportunities for the healthy to demonstrate mercy. This exchange, suffering for alms, was part of the hidden economy of medieval Christianity. Endowments and rents beyond daily labor. Some colonies benefited from larger economic structures. Wealthy patrons endowed hospitals with land, mills, or houses in towns. Rent from these properties provided steady income. A vineyard might supply wine, both for sacramental use and for modest consumption. A mill might yield grain ground into flour for bread. In larger towns, such as Paris or London, certain leper houses accumulated significant endowments, making them small but stable institutions. Others survived on the edge, dependent on irregular gifts and the uncertain yield of small plots. The gap between wealthy and poor colonies mirrored the inequalities of medieval society at large. internal exchange and cooperation inside the colonies. Exchange was often informal. A resident with skill in sewing might repair garments in return for food. Someone able to read might recite prayers for others, offering comfort in exchange for assistance with chores. These small trades, though not recorded in official accounts, formed the fabric of daily survival. Work also created bonds. Shared labor in gardens or workshops brought residents together, easing the loneliness of isolation. Even those unable to work contributed in spirit, offering prayers or moral support. Survival was communal. No one lived entirely alone, even if the wider world kept its distance. Economic vulnerability. Despite these efforts, leper colonies remained fragile. A poor harvest, a lapse in donations, or political turmoil could push them into crisis. Some records speak of leper houses collapsing, their residents left to wander or beg without shelter. Others note disputes between colonies and towns over resources. With councils cutting support in lean years, lepers were doubly vulnerable. Their illness limited their ability to earn a living, and their social stigma restricted their options. Work within colonies softened this vulnerability, but it never erased it. Survival was always precarious, balanced between charity, labor, and necessity. The dignity of work still, for many lepers, work provided dignity. Tending a garden, weaving cloth, or carrying water gave meaning to days otherwise overshadowed by illness. Labor turned residents from passive sufferers into active contributors, sustaining both themselves and their communities. The economy of leper colonies was modest, even invisible compared to the bustling trades of medieval towns. But within its quiet rhythms, the turning of soil, the hum of spinning wheels, the rattle of clappers on the road, we find a portrait of resilience, unresolved thought when we hear of these hidden economies. One question lingers: were leper colonies simply shadows of ordinary society, mimicking its work on a smaller scale? Or did they create a unique form of community where survival and spirituality blended into something distinct? By the time the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the distinctive sound of the leper's clapper, once so familiar on the roads and in the market squares of Europe, grew fainter until it disappeared almost entirely. Lepers, once visible symbols of suffering and exclusion, seemed to vanish from the social landscape. But their disappearance was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, shaped by changes in medicine, society, religion, and the wider sweep of history, the waning of the disease. The first factor in the decline of leper colonies was the changing prevalence of leprosy itself. Modern medical historians debate the reasons, but by the late 15th and 16th centuries, cases of leprosy in Europe became markedly fewer. Some suggest that the rise of tuberculosis, a disease that may have offered a degree of biological competition, played a role. Others point to improvements in diet, housing, and hygiene that lessened the spread. It is also possible that genetic factors and natural resistance gradually reduced susceptibility. Whatever the cause, the numbers declined, and with fewer sufferers, the institutions built to house them lost their original purpose. The shadow of other diseases. At the same time, other diseases claimed the spotlight. The Black Death of the 14th century reshaped Europe's demographic and social fabric in ways far more dramatic than leprosy ever had. Later outbreaks of plague continued to dominate public fear, while syphilis, a new disease in the late 15th century, captured the attention of physicians and preachers alike. In this shifting landscape, leprosy seemed almost tame, a fading threat overshadowed by deadlier or more sensational illnesses. Lepers, once regarded with terror, became rarer and less central in the imagination of the public. The transformation of hospitals as the number of lepers declined. Many leper houses found themselves empty or underused. Rather than let buildings go to waste, communities repurposed them. Some became almshouses for the poor, others hospitals for the sick, and still others hostels for travelers or pilgrims. The very word hospital, once closely tied to leper houses, broadened in meaning. Care for the sick expanded beyond leprosy, and the structures that had once symbolized exclusion became places of more general charity. In this way, the legacy of leper colonies lived on, though in altered form. Shifting religious attitudes, the religious meaning of leprosy also changed. In earlier centuries, lepers were cast as living parables, embodiments of sin, reminders of mortality, and opportunities for charity. As their numbers dwindled, this symbolic role weakened. Preachers found new images in plague, poverty, and other afflictions. The rituals once tied to lepers, such as the leper mass, fell into disuse. Reformation movements in the 16th century further reshaped attitudes. Protestant reformers, skeptical of certain forms of ritualized charity, redirected attention away from leper-specific almsgiving. Catholic reformers, too, emphasized new forms of piety and service. Lepers, once at the center of a symbolic world, faded into the background of religious concern. Economic and political factors. Economics played a role as well. Many leper houses relied on land endowments or steady donations. As residents dwindled, towns and rulers saw opportunities to redirect these resources. Properties once dedicated to lepers were seized, sold, or reassigned to other institutions. In some cases, disputes arose over who controlled these assets, with civic authorities and church officials vying for ownership politically. The decline of leper colonies reflected the growing centralization of states. As monarchies expanded their reach, local institutions were often reorganized or dissolved. Lepers, who had once been managed through a patchwork of local statutes and customs, became less of a distinct administrative category. The vanishing presence, by the 16th century, the once common figure of the leper with clapper or bell was rare in most of Western Europe. The silence of their absence was striking. Streets that had echoed with their warnings now bustled with other figures: merchants, pilgrims, beggars, soldiers. The symbolic weight they once carried did not vanish entirely. Sermons and stories still recalled them, but their living presence diminished. Travelers noticed the change. Accounts from the 15th and 16th centuries sometimes remarked on how few lepers were now seen compared to earlier times. Where once every town had its leper house, now many stood empty, crumbling, or converted. The fear that had shaped laws and rituals for centuries slowly ebbed, leaving only traces in memory and record. Legacy and memory. Though leper colonies disappeared, their legacy remained woven into European history. Some of the buildings survived, repurposed as schools, almshouses, or chapels. Place names: St. Lazarus Field, Leper Lane, Maison des Lépreux, continued to remind communities of their past. In literature and art, lepers lingered as symbols of suffering and exclusion. Even when few remained alive, modern archaeology and archival research have uncovered more about these institutions, their cemeteries, their daily routines, their role in medieval society. What emerges is not only a history of disease, but also a history of human resilience, adaptation, and meaning. Reflections, the disappearance of leper colonies, invites a final reflection. For centuries, lepers were among the most visible outsiders in Europe, set apart, marked by sound and symbol, feared and pitied in equal measure. Their gradual vanishing shows how societies change. What seems central in one era can fade in another, leaving only echoes. It also challenges us to think about how illness and exclusion intersect. Medieval lepers were not only patients, but also symbols bound into systems of charity, fear, and meaning. Their disappearance reminds us that diseases are never only biological. They are also cultural, shaping and shaped by the societies in which they exist. And so, the sound of the clapper faded from the medieval world, leaving behind silence, memory, and lessons about how humans respond to suffering. But one question lingers. As lepers vanished from the streets and colonies of Europe, did society truly grow more compassionate, or did it simply find new groups to exclude? Story 3. Catherine de' Medici, the quiet power behind the French throne. When Catherine de' Medici left her birthplace of Florence in 1533 to marry into the French royal family, she could not have known that her name would one day become synonymous with both admiration and suspicion. Born into the powerful Medici banking dynasty, her life began amidst wealth, patronage, and the arts of Renaissance Italy. Yet her early years were not those of a pampered heiress. Orphaned young, tossed between political factions, and shaped by the turbulent politics of her homeland, Catherine learned early the value of patience, resilience, and quiet survival. The orphan of Florence, Catherine was born in 1519, the only legitimate child of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman, but her parents both died within weeks of her birth, leaving her vulnerable in a city where power was contested between the Medici family and their enemies. For much of her childhood, Florence was a battleground. When the Medici were expelled from power, Catherine was placed in a convent for safety, a young girl caught in the shifting tides of politics. The convent years were formative, surrounded by nuns, scripture, and a rhythm of prayer. Catherine developed a sense of discipline and self-control that would mark her later life. She also learned to observe silently, to blend into her surroundings when necessary. Though she was still only a child, she had already acquired the tools of patience and watchfulness, traits that would later serve her well in the treacherous atmosphere of the French court. A marriage arranged by the Pope. Her fortunes changed when her uncle, Pope Clement VII, arranged her marriage to Henry, the second son of King Francis I of France. The union was intended to cement an alliance between the Medici and the French crown. Catherine, at just 14 years old, left Italy for France, carrying with her not only her Medici heritage, but also the expectations of her powerful relatives. For France, the marriage was politically useful, but not especially prestigious. Catherine was not a princess of great territorial power, and Henry himself was not expected to inherit the throne. Still, the Medici name carried wealth and influence, and the marriage was celebrated with grandeur. On October 28, 1533, in the city of Marseille, Catherine wed Henry in a ceremony filled with pageantry. Yet, beneath the glitter, uncertainties lurked the French court, a world of splendor and rivalry arriving at the French court. Catherine entered a world dazzlingly different from the cloisters of Florence. The court of Francis I was one of the most splendid in Europe, filled with poets, painters, scholars, and architects, many of whom the king had invited from Italy. Castles echoed with music, gardens bloomed in geometrical patterns, and tournaments filled the air with the clashing of lances. Yet behind this brilliance lay rivalries and insecurities. The French nobility was powerful and proud, often jealous of outsiders. Catherine, a foreign bride of modest political standing, was watched with suspicion. She had wealth, yes, but little immediate influence. Too many at court. She was a decorative figure rather than a decisive one. The struggle for an heir, Catherine's greatest challenge in her early years as Duchess of Orleans, was her inability to produce children. For over a decade after her marriage, she remained childless. In a world where a queen's primary duty was to secure the succession, this was a dangerous weakness. Whispered rumors questioned her fertility. Some even suggested that her marriage might be annulled. Adding to Catherine's difficulties was the presence of Henry's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than her husband, but still strikingly elegant and politically astute. Henry adored Diane, who became his lifelong companion and wielded enormous influence over him. Catherine, young, inexperienced, and foreign, found herself sidelined. It was in this atmosphere, marginalized, doubted, and overshadowed, that Catherine once again drew upon the lessons of her childhood: patience, silence, and watchfulness. She did not openly challenge Diane's place in Henry's life, nor did she rebel against the court's suspicions. Instead, she waited. The turning point, fate, in time, shifted. After 10 years of childlessness, Catherine at last conceived. In 1544, she gave birth to her first son. Her role changed dramatically, from a queen at risk of disgrace to the mother of future monarchs. Though Henry remained devoted to Diane de Poitiers, Catherine's position was now secure. She had fulfilled her duty to the throne. More importantly, she had learned how to survive in a hostile environment without losing composure. These lessons would soon prove vital, for Catherine's future was not to be that of a passive consort, but of a powerful widow and regent in one of France's most turbulent eras, foreshadowing the future looking back. Catherine's early years in Florence and her initial struggles in France appear as preparation for the trials to come. She had known danger, exclusion, and doubt. She had learned to survive by watching and waiting, by concealing her thoughts, and by slowly turning disadvantages into strengths. In the years ahead, she would be called upon to wield power in ways no one had expected from the quiet Medici bride. Civil wars, religious conflicts, court intrigues, and accusations of poison and sorcery would swirl around her name. But in 1533, as a young girl entering the glittering yet perilous French court, she was only beginning the journey that would make her one of the most controversial figures in European history. When Henry II, son of Francis I, unexpectedly became heir to the French throne, Catherine's life shifted once again. What had begun as a dynastic marriage of modest significance was suddenly elevated to the center of France's future. Catherine, once overlooked and doubted, was now the woman destined to be queen consort. Yet her position remained far from secure. For though she carried the Medici name and had finally borne heirs, Catherine was caught between the political ambitions of her husband, the lingering shadow of his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and the dangerous turbulence of a kingdom strained by war and religion. Henry's path to the throne, the turning point, came with the death of Henry's elder brother, Francis, the Dauphin of France. In 1536, the cause of his death remains debated. Some said illness, others whispered poison. Whatever the truth, the event placed Henry directly in line to inherit the throne. Suddenly, Catherine's marriage no longer seemed secondary. She was now the wife of the future king. The court's perception of Catherine shifted, though not entirely in her favor. Many nobles still viewed her as an Italian outsider, more useful for her Medici wealth than for her lineage. The Valois line was ancient and proud, and Catherine's position, though elevated, was constantly under scrutiny. Her patience and restraint would once again prove her most reliable allies. Diane de Poitiers, the other queen. No account of Catherine's time as queen consort can be told without Diane de Poitiers, Henry's mistress and confidant. Their relationship was one of the most unusual in European courts. Diane, 20 years senior, had become his guiding figure since his youth. She was not only his lover, but also his political advisor, mentor, and even maternal figure. When Henry became king in 1547, it was Diane, not Catherine, who commanded his affection and attention. She dressed in the colors of black and white, symbolizing constancy and elegance, and her presence at court was commanding. Henry entrusted her with estates, jewels, and influence that might otherwise have belonged to the queen. Even symbols of royal authority, such as the crown jewels, sometimes passed through Diane's hands before Catherine's. For Catherine, this was a humiliation she could do little to challenge. She could not banish Diane without angering Henry, nor could she rival Diane's maturity, wit, and experience. Instead, Catherine played a subtler game. She fulfilled her duties as queen, maintaining dignity and composure in public. She bore child after child, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty, and she waited silently for the day when circumstances might shift the balance of power. The role of a queen consort in the 16th century, the duties of a queen consort were both limited and significant. Catherine was expected to serve as a symbol of fertility and dynastic continuity, to host ceremonies with grace, and to act as the moral center of the court. She was not supposed to interfere in politics, which remained the domain of the king and his advisors. Catherine, however, had been raised in the political hothouse of Florence. She understood dynastic maneuvering, the power of appearances, and the importance of alliances. While she did not directly oppose Diane, Catherine began quietly cultivating her own network of allies. She corresponded with relatives in Italy, drew upon Medici financial resources, and paid close attention to the details of governance that others overlooked. Her interest in astrology, medicine, and even alchemy also became noted, though these pursuits later fueled rumors of sorcery. In Catherine's time, they reflected both curiosity and a desire for knowledge that extended beyond ceremonial duties. For a woman whose public role was constrained, such studies offered a measure of private power turns in turmoil. While Catherine navigated the intricacies of court life, France itself was under strain. Wars with the Habsburg Empire drained resources, while the Reformation began to fracture religious unity. Protestant ideas, carried by merchants, scholars, and preachers, spread through towns and cities, provoking suspicion and conflict. The French monarchy, rooted in Catholic tradition, faced the growing challenge of dissent. Henry II, though devoted to Catholicism, was not always a decisive ruler. He leaned heavily on advisors, favorites, and, of course, Diane. Catherine observed closely, taking note of how policies were shaped, which factions gained influence, and how the nobility shifted loyalties. Though still consort, she was beginning to build the political awareness that would later define her regency. Motherhood as power. If Catherine could not dominate her husband's affections, she could still secure her future through her children. By the time Henry became king, Catherine had given birth to several sons and daughters. This achievement alone transformed her standing. She was no longer the childless, endangered bride of earlier years. She was the mother of heirs to the French crown. Her eldest son, Francis, was groomed to succeed his father. Other children, including Charles and Henry, later Henry III, would also play roles in the monarchy. Her daughters, meanwhile, became valuable assets in the web of dynastic marriages that tied France to other European powers. Catherine understood that in an era when queens wielded little formal authority, the marriages and alliances of her children could secure her own influence. The fatal tournament. Catherine's years as queen consort reached their dramatic turning point in 1559. That year, Henry II arranged a series of festivities to celebrate the marriage of his daughter, Elizabeth, to King Philip II of Spain. Among the events was a jousting tournament in Paris, a display of knightly valor and royal magnificence. Henry insisted on participating, despite concerns for his safety. In the final joust, he faced Gabriel de Montgomery, captain of his Scottish Guard. As lances shattered upon impact, a splinter pierced Henry's eye and skull. The wound proved fatal. After lingering in agony for several days, Henry II died on July 10, 1559. The accident transformed Catherine's life. In an instant, she was no longer queen consort, but queen mother and dowager. More importantly, she was the guardian of her young son, Francis II, who, at only 15 years old, ascended the throne. With the king too young to govern independently, Catherine's role shifted from ceremonial to political. She would now step into the very heart of French politics, a place she had quietly studied for decades, the widow's black from Henry's death onward. Catherine adopted mourning attire, the somber black gowns that became her trademark. In a court of color and splendor, her dark dress was striking. It signified both her grief and her enduring presence. She was no longer the overshadowed wife of a king devoted to another woman. She was now the queen mother, the pivot around which the future of France revolved. Yet questions abounded. Could Catherine, long sidelined by Diane de Poitiers, truly wield power? Would the nobles accept her authority, or would they exploit her youth and inexperience? How would she balance the rising tensions between Catholics and Protestants, which now threatened to erupt into violence? Catherine herself must have asked these questions as she stood beside her son, the new king, and looked upon a realm restless with ambition and conflict. The years of waiting were over. Her time had come, and so Catherine de' Medici, once a silent figure in the shadow of Diane de Poitiers, emerged as one of the central actors of French history. The court that had once dismissed her as irrelevant would now revolve around her decisions. But what kind of ruler would she become? Would she lean on the caution she had learned in childhood, or would she wield her authority with boldness? When Henry II died in 1559, Catherine de' Medici's life entered its most consequential chapter. No longer confined to the role of consort, no longer overshadowed by Diane de Poitiers, Catherine was suddenly placed at the center of power. Her eldest son, Francis II, was only 15 when he ascended the throne, too young and inexperienced to rule independently. Catherine, as Queen Mother, would not only guide him, but, through him, the kingdom itself. It was not an enviable position. France was a nation strained by financial difficulties, military losses, and, most dangerously, religious conflict. The spread of Protestantism, in the form of the Huguenot movement, was eroding Catholic unity. Nobles were divided into factions, some supporting Protestant reforms, others fiercely defending Catholic orthodoxy. Into this atmosphere of suspicion, rivalry, and violence stepped Catherine de' Medici, armed with nothing more than her patience, intelligence, and instinct for survival. The fragile reign of Francis II's reign was brief and troubled. Married to Mary, Queen of Scots, Francis was heavily influenced by Mary's uncles, the powerful Guise family, who were militant Catholics. Their dominance at court alarmed rival noble houses, particularly the Bourbons, who leaned toward Protestant sympathies. Catherine, though mother of the king, found herself sidelined in her son's counsels, just as she had once been marginalized during Henry's reign. Yet she understood that Francis's frail health and inexperience made his reign precarious. If he failed, her future and the stability of her children's inheritance were at risk. In December 1560, Francis II died suddenly at the age of 16, likely from an ear infection that spread fatally. His younger brother, Charles IX, only 10 years old, now inherited the crown. At last, Catherine's position was unambiguous. She became regent of France, ruling in her son's name until he came of age. A regent's balancing act. Catherine's regency began in 1560 and immediately faced the challenge of religious division. She did not see herself as an ideologue. She was neither a zealous Catholic like the Guise, nor an eager supporter of the Protestants. Her instinct was one of pragmatism, to keep the kingdom intact and protect her son's fragile dynasty. She attempted conciliation. In 1562, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint Germain, granting limited toleration to Protestants, allowing them to worship privately outside of towns. It was a cautious step toward compromise, but it infuriated hardline Catholics. That same year, tragedy struck. In March 1562, at the town of Vassy, soldiers of the Duke of Guise attacked a Protestant congregation, killing dozens. The massacre ignited open conflictive, a series of brutal civil wars that would torment France for decades. The Queen Mother, as negotiator through it all, Catherine worked tirelessly as a negotiator. She arranged meetings between Catholic and Protestant leaders, organized conferences, and tried to present herself as a mediator above factional strife. She traveled extensively across France, often accompanied by her young sons, to show the monarchy's presence and encourage loyalty. Yet her attempts at neutrality satisfied no one. Catholics accused her of weakness, of giving too much ground to heresy. Protestants, meanwhile, distrusted her motives, suspecting that her concessions were temporary ploys. Catherine walked a line so thin it seemed destined to collapse. Suspicion and the shadow of poison as the wars deepened. Catherine's reputation began to darken. Rumors circulated that she dabbled in poison, astrology, and occult practices. Her Italian origins, her association with Florentine culture, and her reliance on astrologers like Nostradamus fueled suspicions. The image of Catherine as the Poison Queen was born a figure whispered about in fearful tones, accused of manipulating events through hidden and sinister means. In truth, Catherine relied less on sorcery than on calculation. She understood the value of symbols, appearances, and careful timing. Her interest in astrology was not unusual for her era, when rulers frequently consulted the stars. Yet, her gender foreignness and growing power made her a target for slander. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Catherine's most infamous moment came in 1572. During the reign of Charles IX, hoping to reconcile Catholics and Protestants, Catherine arranged the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the Protestant Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France. The wedding brought Protestant leaders to Paris, including Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the Huguenot movement's most important figures. Tensions boiled. Days after the wedding, Coligny was wounded in an assassination attempt. Fearing Protestant retaliation and under intense pressure from Catholic hardliners, the Crown ordered a purge of Protestant leaders. On August 24, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day, violence erupted in Paris. Protestants were slaughtered in the streets, and the massacre spread to other towns, claiming thousands of lives. Catherine's role in these events remains debated. Some argue she approved or even orchestrated the massacre. Others suggest she was swept along by forces beyond her control. What is certain is that her reputation never recovered. Too many Protestants across Europe, she became the embodiment of cruelty and treachery. To Catholic extremists, she was still too cautious, too willing to compromise. The later years, survival above all after Charles IX's death in 1574. Catherine's third son became king as Henry III. Though grown, Henry still relied heavily on his mother's counsel. Catherine continued to act as mediator, envoy, and stabilizer, even as the wars of religion dragged on. She traveled tirelessly into her 60s, negotiating with nobles, calming uprisings, and trying to hold together a monarchy that seemed perpetually on the brink of collapse. Her final years were marked by exhaustion and tragedy. Henry III, facing rebellion from the ultra-Catholic League and threats from Protestant factions, struggled to assert authority. Catherine, ever the pragmatist, urged compromise where possible, though her influence waned as younger factions rose to prominence. She died in January 1589 at the age of 69. Within months, Henry III himself was assassinated, leaving the throne to Henry of Navarre, the Protestant son-in-law, Catherine, had once helped bring into the royal family. He would convert to Catholicism to secure his crown as Henry IV, ushering in a new dynasty. The Bourbons' legacy of a survivor, Catherine de' Medici, remains one of history's most controversial queens. To some, she was a shrewd, pragmatic ruler who held France together during one of its darkest periods. To others, she was a manipulative schemer whose name became synonymous with poison and treachery. What is undeniable is her resilience. From an orphaned girl in Florence to an overlooked bride in France, to the widow who guided 3 sons onto the throne, Catherine's life was one of constant adaptation. She survived exile, infertility, neglect, widowhood, slander, and civil war. Few rulers, male or female, have faced such relentless challenges and endured for so long, and yet, perhaps the most telling part of Catherine's story is her ordinariness in the face of extraordinary events. She was not a conqueror, nor a saint, nor a revolutionary. She was a woman navigating the realities of power in an age when women were seldom allowed near it. Her life is less a tale of glory than one of survival, an endless balancing act between factions, faiths, and family. A closing reflection: if you imagine Catherine in her final years, seated in black mourning clothes at one of her palaces, you might picture her looking back not with triumph but with weary endurance. She had held a kingdom together when it might have splintered apart. She had preserved her children's legacy, even if it ultimately passed to another dynasty. And yet, one cannot help but ask, if Catherine had never been there, if she had not worked tirelessly to mediate, to negotiate, to compromise, would France have collapsed far sooner into chaos? Or was she, in her very efforts, part of the problem, delaying the inevitable shift that history demanded? Story 4. The Forgotten Daily Lives inside a medieval leper house. In the medieval imagination, leprosy was more than a disease. It was a sentence, a symbol, and a separation from the ordinary rhythms of life. To be marked as a leper was not only to suffer a chronic illness that disfigured the body, but also to be cast out of one's community, forced to inhabit a strange borderland between life and death. Across Europe, towns and villages built leper houses, sometimes called leprosaria, where those afflicted were sent to live, often for the rest of their lives. If you were a traveler approaching such a house in the 13th or 14th century, you might not notice it at first. Many were built just outside the walls of towns, near crossroads or bridges, deliberately set apart so that those within could not mingle freely with those outside. At first glance, these places might resemble a monastery: low stone buildings, a chapel at the center, gardens laid out in quiet rows. Yet the bells, the silence, and the knowledge of who lived there made leper houses distinct, marked by both pity and dread. The ceremony of exile, the separation of a leper from their community, was not informal. In many towns, the process was ritualized with a disturbing precision. Once a person was judged to have the disease by clerics, physicians, or civic officials, they could be subjected to what some sources describe as a funeral rite. Imagine standing in your parish church, alive and breathing, while the priest recited prayers for the dead. Earth might be sprinkled upon your body as if you were already buried. You were declared dead to the world of the living. Your property was sometimes seized, your marriage dissolved, your rights stripped away. When you left the church, it was not to return to your home, but to cross the threshold of the leper house. Such ceremonies, though not universal, were symbolic of the mindset of the age. Lepers were considered both alive and dead, human yet set apart, a reminder of mortality and divine punishment, walking in plain sight, crossing the threshold once inside the leper house. Daily life took on a peculiar rhythm. The first impression would be quiet. These were not bustling hospitals. They were more like small, enclosed communities. Some leper houses held only a dozen residents, others perhaps 50. In larger cities, such as Paris or London, there could be several institutions scattered outside the gates, each housing those who had been separated from ordinary society. The buildings typically included a small chapel where Mass was celebrated daily, dormitories or individual cells, depending on resources, kitchens, gardens, and sometimes workshops. In some cases, a cemetery within the grounds. For few lepers left once they had entered. The spaces were designed not only for care, but also for containment. The walls that enclosed the grounds were both protective and symbolic, keeping the sick safe from hostility, but also keeping them apart from the world. The rules of living a part life in a leper house was structured by rules, often borrowed from monastic orders. Residents were expected to live communally, to pray at regular hours, and to follow a discipline of silence or restraint. Contact with outsiders was heavily regulated. Lepers were often forbidden from touching others, from eating or drinking with the healthy, or even from walking on the same side of the road as travelers when they ventured out. Some were given small wooden clappers or bells to carry to signal their approach. The sound warned the healthy to keep their distance. It also reinforced the sense of separation. The leper was a marked presence, announced before they could be seen. Food was provided by alms, donations, or endowments from wealthy patrons. Many towns considered it a civic duty or even a spiritual obligation to support leper houses. To give bread to a leper was an act of charity, believed to bring blessings. And so, even as lepers were excluded, they were also the recipients of a peculiar kind of care, ostracized, yet fed, feared, yet prayed for, inside the community, within the walls. Life could be surprisingly ordinary, though shadowed by suffering. Residents cooked meals, tended gardens, raised chickens, or repaired buildings. They prayed together, sometimes sang hymns, and shared stories of the lives they had left behind. Friendships formed, as did small rivalries and disputes. Just as in any human community, medical care, such as it was limited. Medieval physicians did not truly understand leprosy. Treatments might include bloodletting, herbal salves, or dietary restrictions. More often, the emphasis was spiritual. Leprosy was seen as a punishment or a test from God, and patience in suffering was praised as a path to salvation. The chapel, not the infirmary, was the heart of the leper house. Yet it would be wrong to imagine these places only as sites of misery. For some, especially the poorest, entering a leper house offered shelter, food, and a measure of security that life outside could not. They were cut off from their families, but they found a new, if fragile, family among others who shared their fate between fear and compassion. The presence of leper houses shaped the imagination of medieval towns. On one hand, They were reminders of divine punishment, physical decay, and the fragility of life. On the other, they became places of charity, where townspeople could demonstrate piety by supporting the afflicted. Processions might be held to collect alms, or local guilds might endow chapels within the leprosaria. This dual perception, fear and compassion, defined how medieval society treated lepers. They were excluded from ordinary life, yet never entirely forgotten. To feed a leper was to feed Christ himself, according to sermons of the age. To turn away from them entirely would be to risk one's own soul. And so, leper houses persisted for centuries, balancing stigma with sanctity, exclusion with care. A life half-levateau walk through a medieval leper house. You would see not only suffering, but also endurance. You might see a man with hands bandaged, tending to herbs in a small garden. You might see a woman praying in the chapel, her voice faint but steady. You might hear the clatter of bowls in the kitchen, or the sound of a bell as someone approached the gate to receive a delivery of bread. It was a life stripped of many joys, family ties, market chatter, civic participation, but it was still a life. A life half-lived, perhaps, but lived nonetheless. And so, the question arises, when we imagine these communities, should we see them as prisons or as sanctuaries? Were they places of despair or of a strange kind of resilience? When the heavy wooden gates of a leper house closed behind a new resident, the outside world seemed to vanish. Yet life within did not stand still. The community had its own rhythms, shaped by prayer, labor, and the slow passing of days. Though the world called these places hospitals, they were less about healing and more about endurance, a place where time itself became both a burden and a companion. Morning bells and prayers. The day often began with the sound of a bell rung from the chapel. Even for the sick and weary, the expectation was that one would rise and attend morning prayers. Monastic influence was strong. The liturgy structured the hours, and lepers were encouraged to see their illness as a way of sharing in Christ's suffering. Inside the small chapel, the smell of wax and incense hung heavy. Some residents leaned on crutches, others covered their sores with cloth, but all gathered together. The priest, sometimes healthy, sometimes himself a leper, intoned the psalms. The prayers were not hurried. They rolled slowly, like a tide, carrying the community through the first light of day. After Mass, silence often lingered. For some, this was the most hopeful moment of the day, a reminder that their pain, though isolating, was not meaningless. For others, it was simply routine, but many encouraged it, both to sustain the community and to provide a sense of dignity. Gardens and fields. Gardens were vital. Even those with weakened limbs could plant, weed, or water. Cabbage, leeks, onions, and herbs filled the beds, simple foods that could be boiled into stews. Medicinal herb, sage, rosemary, or marjoram were also cultivated, though their curative power was more symbolic than effective. Animals and chickens. Some houses kept chickens, goats, or even a cow. Milk and eggs provided much-needed nourishment, and tending animals gave residents tasks that connected them to the rhythms of life beyond their walls. Crafts and repairs. A few leper houses encouraged simple crafts, weaving baskets, mending clothing, or carving wooden spoons. These objects could be sold at nearby markets, bringing in small income. Repairs were constant. Mortar crumbled, roofs leaked, fences sagged, and residents who still had strength lent their hands. Even so, labor was not harsh or compulsory. The sick could work at their own pace, often in silence. Each task a small assertion that life still held meaning. Meals and charity meals marked the slow hours of the day. Bread was a staple, coarse and dark, supplemented by vegetable stews or porridge. On feast days, there might be fish or a bit of meat, gifts from patrons or local guilds. Charity played a central role. Townspeople brought alms loaves of bread, barrels of ale, cloth for garments. Some wealthy patrons endowed regular donations, their names recorded in prayers. Even those who feared contact with lepers might drop coins into a wooden collection box at the gate, avoiding direct touch but still fulfilling the Christian duty of mercy. Inside, meals were eaten communally, though the sickest sometimes dined in their beds. Conversation was allowed, but voices were often hushed. For many, eating was less about nourishment and more about the comfort of not being entirely alone. Rules of separation daily. Life was shaped not only by what lepers did, but also by what they could not do. Rules varied by region, but common restrictions included no sharing of cups, dishes, or utensils with outsiders, no entering inns, markets, or churches in town, no touching children or healthy adults, no bathing in public rivers or wells. When a resident had reason to leave, perhaps to beg for alms or to attend an outdoor procession, they carried a wooden clapper or a small bell. The sound was both a warning and a stigma. Imagine approaching a crossroads, the faint rattle of a clapper ahead, and the crowd stepping aside in uneasy silence. These rules were meant to prevent contagion. Though medieval people misunderstood how leprosy spread, but they also served a symbolic role, reminding everyone that lepers were set apart, living in the shadow of death. Afternoons of quiet work, the afternoons were slower. Some residents rested bodies weakened by fever or sores. Others worked in the gardens, fed animals, or repaired tools. Women might spin wool or mend clothes. The air around the house was often calm, broken only by the sound of birds or the scraping of a hoe in the soil. For many, afternoons were the most ordinary time of day, for hours when life, though diminished, felt almost like what it had once been. Yet there was also a strange emptiness. Lepers knew that outside the walls, markets bustled, churches filled with worshippers, and families gathered. Inside, they lived in a world apart, a community of the excluded. Evening devotions and stories. As the sun sank, the chapel bell called the residents again. Evening prayers were shorter, but still solemn. Psalms were sung in low voices, the flickering of candles casting shadows on the walls. Afterward, there was sometimes storytelling. In the dim light of the hall, residents recalled tales from their youth stories of villages they would never see again, of pilgrimages, of markets, of festivals. Some spoke of miracles and saints, clinging to hope that healing might one day come. Others told simple tales meant only to pass the time. For newcomers, these gatherings offered comfort. For the long resident, they were reminders that memory was the last connection to the world outside. The long silence of night descended heavily on the leper house. Dormitories were quiet except for coughs, the shifting of straw mattresses, and the occasional cry of pain. Oil lamps burned low, and the air grew damp and cold. For many, night was the hardest time. The silence magnified fears, fear of death, fear of abandonment, fear of the unknown. Yet, it was also a time for whispered prayers, for private thoughts, for clinging to the fragments of hope left within. The cycle of prayer, labor, meals, and silence repeated endlessly. Days blurred into months, months into years. Some residents lived only a short while. Others endured for decades. Few left, except by death. A community of the half-living ordinary rhythms of the leper house reveal a paradox. Residents were excluded from the world, yet they formed a world of their own. They prayed, worked, ate, told stories, and tended gardens. Their lives were smaller, but not erased. To call these places prisons is not entirely fair. To call them sanctuaries is also incomplete. They were both. They were liminal spaces where human beings lived on the margins, shaping a fragile but enduring community in the shadow of exclusion. In the quiet isolation of the medieval leper house, life often moved slowly, with the repetition of prayer, labor, and silence stretching across years. Yet death, inevitable and unrelenting, punctuated this rhythm. For the lepers who lived within those walls, dying was not merely the end of an illness, it was a deeply social and spiritual event, one that revealed the paradox of their place in society, cast out in life, yet often honored in death. The approach of deathfulness did not always claim its victims suddenly. For many lepers, the approach of death was drawn out over months or even years. As sores spread, fingers curled, and eyesight dimmed, the body gave unmistakable signals. In the communal dormitories, residents learned to recognize the signs: shallow breathing, fever that no herbs could cool, a sudden quietness in one who had once spoken freely. Fellow residents gathered near the dying, offering simple comforts: a cloth soaked in water, whispered prayers, a hand placed on the arm. Though they had been cast away from their families, lepers rarely died alone. Within the walls of their community, they found companions who understood both their suffering and their resilience. Prayers for the departing soul, rituals surrounding death in a leper house, carried both solemnity and hope. When a resident's final hour drew near, the priest or chaplain was summoned to administer the sacraments. Holy water was sprinkled, confessions were heard, and the Eucharist was offered. The prayers recited for the dying often emphasized Christ's own suffering, linking the pain of leprosy to the wounds of the crucifixion. For the leper, this was both a consolation and a meaning. Their disease, viewed as a curse by the outside world, was here reframed as a participation in the divine dot after the final breath. Bells were sometimes rung to announce the death, their tones carrying beyond the walls. Even those who feared to enter the leper house might pause in their fields or streets, recognizing that another soul had departed. Burial within and without where a leper was buried depended on the rules of the particular community. Some houses had their own small cemeteries enclosed within the grounds. Here, simple wooden crosses marked the graves, names carved with care but rarely lasting long against weather and time. Other houses buried their dead in consecrated ground near a local parish, though often in sections reserved for the marginalized. The funerals were simple: a procession of residents, a few whispered psalms, the lowering of the body wrapped in a coarse shroud. There was no elaborate monument, no stone effigy, only the earth and the memory of those who had lived alongside the deceased. Yet even in this simplicity, there was dignity. In a society that often treated lepers as less than human, the act of burial affirmed their belonging to the Christian community. In death, they were not entirely forgotten, inscribing names in books of remembrance. Priests offered masses for their souls, funded by donations from patrons or by the modest income of the hospital. Wealthier lepers occasionally left bequests, coins, clothing, or tools passed down to the house, ensuring that prayers would continue after their passing. For the living, commemoration served as a reminder that life, though diminished, still held value. Each death was both a rupture and a continuation. The community mourned, but the cycle of daily life prayer, meals, work resumed, binding the survivors together. The afterlife of memory beyond the walls. The memory of lepers was complex. In some places, townspeople spoke with pity, recalling the sight of beggars shaking their clappers. In others, they spoke with fear, convinced that lepers spread corruption or had been punished by God. Yet medieval sermons sometimes praised lepers as living examples of patience and humility. Pilgrims traveling near leper houses might stop to give alms, believing that helping the afflicted could shorten their own time in purgatory. In this way, lepers remained present in the moral imagination of the age, even as they were physically excluded. Archaeological echoes, centuries later, traces of leper cemeteries still emerge. Excavations have revealed skeletons bearing the unmistakable marks of the disease, thinned bones of the nose, shortened fingers, disfigured feet. Some were buried with rosary beads, small wooden crosses, or fragments of clothing. These remains remind us that though their lives were diminished by isolation, lepers were never entirely erased. Their bones speak of endurance, of communities that lived and died together, holding on to dignity in the face of exclusion. The symbol of the leper by the later Middle Ages. The figure of the leper became as much a symbol as a reality. Preachers used leprosy to illustrate moral lessons, the corruption of sin, the humility of suffering, or the necessity of charity. Even as leprosy itself declined in Europe after the 14th century, the memory of the leper house lingered in imagination and architecture. Empty chapels, crumbling walls, and place names that still mark their sites today. To remember the leper is to confront the uneasy balance of medieval life, exclusion and charity, stigma and compassion, suffering and dignity, a reflection across time for us today. The story of the medieval leper house offers more than historical curiosity. It invites reflection on how societies respond to illness, difference, and fear. Just as lepers were once cast to the margins, modern history holds its own examples of exclusion, whether through quarantines, social stigma, or prejudice. The leper's life was not only one of suffering, but of endurance. Within the walls, they created rhythms of prayer, work, and memory. In death, they claimed a dignity denied to them in life. And in the centuries since, their story lingers as a quiet reminder that history is not only shaped by kings and battles, but also by those who lived quietly on the margins, shaping fragile communities of resilience. Story 5. The Silent Pages, Parchment Makers, and the hidden labor of books. When you imagine a medieval manuscript, your thoughts might leap to the shining letters of gold, the delicate vines curling around the margins, or the careful script that winds steadily across the page. Yet, before ink ever touched parchment, and before monks ever bent their backs in scriptoria, there was a far quieter, grittier labor, the making of the very surface upon which all those words were written. To understand a manuscript, you must begin not in the library or the monastery, but in the pasture. The story of a book begins with animals, with hides, with long hours of scraping and stretching. The parchmenter, the quiet craftsperson of the page, rarely earned mention in chronicles or poems. But without their work, the words of saints, kings, and poets could not have survived. Animals for books. Parchment, unlike paper, came from skin. Calves, sheep, and goats were the primary providers, each hide carrying its own qualities. Calfskin vellum, prized for its smoothness, pale in color, and often used for luxury books. Sheepskin, more common, with a slightly oily surface and a faintly yellow tint. Goatskin, tougher, sometimes darker, and favored for durability. The choice of animal depended not only on quality, but on availability. A monastery in the north of England, with flocks of sheep nearby, might use sheep almost exclusively. An Italian workshop, where goats were common, might prefer their hides. In every case, the making of parchment was an act of transformation, taking the skin of a living creature and converting it into a blank surface that would hold centuries of thought, selection, and first steps. When an animal was slaughtered, either for food or after illness, its skin was quickly stripped and set aside. Not all hides were suitable. Deep scars, insect bites, or rough textures could ruin a page. The parchmenter learned to see beyond the blood and hair, imagining how the skin might stretch, how thin it might be shaved, how smooth it could become. The hides were soaked in water, first to loosen dirt and blood. This was heavy, wet work. Barrels or troughs were filled, hides submerged, and the stench began to rise, a sour smell of damp flesh, strong enough to cling to the skin of workers for days. The lime bath, the true transformation, began in lime pits. The hides were soaked in vats of water mixed with lime, an alkaline solution that loosened hair and fat. Days could pass in this soaking. The hides stirred occasionally with poles. For the parchmenter, the lime bath was both friend and foe. It prepared the skin for scraping, but it also burned the hands, cracked fingernails, and irritated lungs if inhaled. Gloves were rare, and most workers bore the marks of their craft on their bodies. When the skins were ready, they were hauled out, heavy and slick, and draped over wooden beams to drain. Already, the hair peeled away with a touch, the first sign of transformation. Scraping and shaving. The next stage was scraping. The hide was stretched across a wooden frame, secured with cords, and pulled taut. Then came the knife, a curved blade held firmly in two hands, pressed against the skin, pulling downward to strip away hair, fat, and flesh. This was slow, exhausting work. The parchmenter needed just the right pressure. Too soft, and the hair remained. Too hard, and the blade sliced through, ruining the sheet. The sound of scraping filled the workshop, steady rasp, 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 punctuated by the occasional curse when the blade slipped. As the scraping continued, the skin grew thinner and whiter. Holes appeared if the hide was weak, but a skilled hand could sometimes work around them, cutting smaller sheets from the good parts, stretching in the frame once scraped. The skin was tightened further on its frame. Ropes pulled it taut, and pegs secured the edges. As it dried, the skin shrank, pulling tighter and tighter, until it became flat and smooth. In the drying sheds, rows of stretched hides filled the air like pale, ghostly sails. Light shone through them in patches, revealing veins and faint textures. The smell of lime and damp flesh lingered, a constant companion to the parchmenter's labor. This stage could not be rushed. Too much sun, and the hide cracked. Too little, and it molded. The parchmenter watched the weather as carefully as any farmer, for the fate of the page depended on the air-tinal smoothing. When the skin was dry, it was not yet parchment. The surface still needed polishing. Pumice stones, chalk dust, and knives were used to smooth imperfections. The goal was a surface, even enough to take ink without blotting, yet still slightly textured to grip the quill. The process might be repeated several times. Scrape, dry, polish, and scrape again. Each pass risked tearing, but also improved the sheet. By the end, what had once been a hairy, bloody hide had become something astonishing, pale, flexible, luminous. The human cost, the making of parchment, was not glamorous. It was hard on the body, foul on the nose, and often poorly paid, yet it was essential. Every sermon copied, every charter recorded, every psalm sung in a monastery depended on it. The parchmenter's work was rarely signed or remembered. Manuscripts might name their scribe, even their illuminator, but seldom the one who prepared the page. And yet, without that hidden labor, the written word would have no surface to rest upon. A quiet transformation. Imagine the parchmenter at the end of a long day, standing in the workshop with lime-stained hands, surrounded by drying skins. To others, it might look like filth, but to the trained eye, it was potential. Each sheet might one day hold prayers whispered by monks, laws decreed by kings, or stories retold by generations. The parchmenter's craft was a bridge between the ordinary and the eternal, between the life of an animal and the memory of a culture. And yet, as we turn the pages of a manuscript centuries later, do we ever pause to think of the hands that scraped, stretched, and polished those skins? The life of parchment did not end with the scraping knife and the drying frame. Once the skins had been transformed into sheets of pale, smooth material, they entered another world, the world of the workshop, of scribes and scriptoria, of ink-stained fingers and whispered prayers. Yet the connection between the parchmenter and the scribe was not always close. Often the parchment art worked in one quarter of town, while the monastery stood in another. The two crafts tied by necessity, but separated by culture and reputation. The parchment workshop as a world of its own. The later Middle Ages. Parchment-making workshops existed in many European towns. Some were little more than sheds by a stream. Others were established businesses with apprentices, tools, and long-standing contracts. Their proximity to water was essential. Hides needed soaking, lime needed washing, and the runoff thick with hair, fat, and lime was best dumped far from the drinking wells of townsfolk. The workshop was a place of practical skill rather than spiritual reflection. The smell, the damp floors, the scraping of knives, the clatter of wooden frames. This was not the lofty silence of a scriptorium. Yet, in its own way, it was just as crucial for the preservation of knowledge. Without the parchmenter's humble shed, the scribe's quiet desk could not exist. Supplying monasteries and universities, monasteries were among the largest consumers of parchment. Scriptoria needed a constant supply to copy Bibles, psalters, saints' lives, and liturgical books. A single Bible could require hundreds of calfskins. But by the 13th century, parchment also flowed into the growing universities. In Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, the rise of academic study created enormous demand for textbooks. Students needed copies of Aristotle, legal manuals, and glossed commentaries. The parchmenters' work thus fed not only prayer, but also scholarship. The scale of this trade meant that parchmenters had to organize themselves carefully. Some worked independently, selling sheets directly. Others formed guilds, setting prices and standards. Contracts specified quality, vellum for fine books, coarser sheepskin for everyday use. Invoices noted how many skins were delivered, how many sheets could be cut, and how much trimming was expected. Marks of the workshopy van. Centuries later, the parchmenter's presence can still be seen in the pages of manuscripts, holes and scars. Some sheets retain natural holes, carefully written around by scribes. Hair side versus flesh side. Parchment has to surfaces the smoother flesh side and the rougher hair side. A trained eye can see the difference, and scribes often had to adjust their strokes accordingly. Knife marks, faint ridges from scraping, or lines where pumice was applied too roughly remain visible. Prickings and rulings. Sometimes parchmenters themselves pricked holes to guide scribes, though often this task fell to the scribes later. To the casual reader, a manuscript seems pristine. To the careful observer, it is filled with the silent fingerprints of the parchmenter's labor. The journey into the scriptorium. Once sheets were delivered, monks or professional scribes began their work. Parchment was folded into quires, ruled with lead point or ink, and prepared for text. Yet parchment was not passive. It warped with humidity, curled at the edges, resisted certain inks. Scribes complained in the margins about poor quality sheets, too greasy, too rough, too thin. Still, they adapted. They pressed sheets between boards, scraped away mistakes with knives, and burnished the surface before adding gold. The partnership between parchmenter and scribe was not always equal, but it was constant. One provided the medium, the other the message. The economics of parchment was costly. A full Bible could represent years of labor and the hides of entire herds. Even smaller works demanded resources far beyond the reach of ordinary people. This expense explains why parchment was reused. Old manuscripts were scraped clean, their text partially erased, to make beneath the words of a new text, the ghost of an older one often lingered, a silent dialogue across centuries. For parchmenters, this economy meant steady, if modest income. They were not wealthy artisans, but neither were they destitute. Their craft was specialized, respected when needed, and largely ignored otherwise. They existed on the margins of the grand cultural achievements they enabled, earning their bread from the skins of animals and the needs of scholars, tools of the crafter. workshop required a surprisingly wide array of tools, scraping knives with curved edges, sharpened daily, stretching frames with cords and pegs, large enough to hold multiple skins, pumice stones for smoothing, chalk or lime dust to whiten and polish, cloth and brushes for cleaning. These tools wore down quickly. Apprentices were expected to care for them, to sharpen knives on whetstones, to replace pegs, to keep dust dry. Much of the workshop's rhythm was not dramatic transformation, but careful maintenance of the tools that made transformation possible. The apprenticeship to become a parchmenter was not a matter of a few weeks' training. It took years of watching, assisting, and gradually taking on more difficult tasks. An apprentice might begin by hauling water, stirring lime vats, or carrying hides. Only later would they be trusted with knives. The master taught not only techniques but judgment. When a hide was too thin to be saved, how long to soak in lime, when the weather was too damp for drying. These skills were rarely written down. They lived in the hands and eyes of those who worked the craft. Distance from glory, one of the most striking aspects of the parchmenters' role, is how little recognition they received. Their work underpinned the greatest intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, the preservation of classical texts, the spread of theology, the flowering of poetry, but their names are almost entirely absent. A scribe might leave a colophon. Brother Matthew wrote this. An illuminator might paint their likeness into a margin. The parchmenter left nothing but the silent sheets themselves, and yet, in many ways, their labor was the most transformative of all. They took what was once flesh, blood, and hair, and made it into a surface for eternity, foreshadowing change. By the late Middle Ages, paper began to spread from the Islamic world, and later from mills in Italy, France, and Germany. Cheaper, easier to produce, and less odorous, paper slowly displaced parchment for many uses. But in the centuries when parchment ruled, it was indispensable. The parchmenter's workshop stood as a bridge between animal life and human thought, between the farmyard and the library. The parchment workshop was not a glamorous place. It smelled of lime and damp hides, rang with scraping knives, and echoed with the complaints of apprentices. But it was there, in those humble sheds, that the raw material of medieval learning was born. And so one wonders, as the monk bent over his desk in silence, copying words of Scripture, did he ever pause to imagine the hands that had labored so hard to prepare the page beneath his quill? When we think of parchment today, we may imagine the yellowed pages of a medieval manuscript in a museum case, or perhaps a fragment of law preserved in an archive. It seems fragile, delicate, almost ghostly. Yet this fragility is misleading. Parchment was, and remains, one of the most durable writing materials ever created. The legacy of parchment lies not only in its endurance, but also in curious ways it has shaped history through the survival of texts, through the recycling of pages, and through the hidden fingerprints of the workers who made it. Durability beyond centuries, unlike papyrus, which cracked and flaked with age, or early paper, which could rot in damp climates. Parchment proved astonishingly resilient. Properly stored, it resists insects, mold, and decay. Manuscripts over 1,000 years old still retain a flexibility that astonishes conservators. This durability gave parchment a role as the guardian of memory, Whole libraries of ancient texts might have vanished if not for the skins of calves, sheep, and goats stretched and dried centuries ago. Works of Aristotle, Virgil, Augustine, and countless others owe their survival to the parchmenter's craft. The palimpsest, writing over the past's durability, had its irony. Because parchment was so costly and long-lasting, it was often reused. The practice of creating a palimpsest, scraping away old writing to make space for new became common. The process was imperfect. Even when scraped or washed, the earlier ink often left faint traces. Modern scholars, using ultraviolet light and digital imaging, have recovered erased layers, sermons hidden beneath grammar lessons, ancient Greek philosophy beneath medieval prayers. One of the most famous examples is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 10th century manuscript overwritten with prayers in the 13th century. Beneath the prayers lay lost treatises by Archimedes, preserved only because parchment refused to surrender its memory entirely. Thus, the parchmenter's product was never truly blank. Even when scraped clean, it carried ghosts of what had been the hidden laborers in the margins for centuries. The parchmenter remained invisible, but their work left physical clues woven into the very structure of books. Stretched veins in thin vellum, faint branching patterns can be seen, veins of the animal, now repurposed as lines for human thought. Thumbprints, sometimes smudges of lime or grease, remain where a hand once held a sheet taut. Workshop dust, traces of pumice, chalk, or hair occasionally became embedded in the parchment itself. Every sheet is, in its way, a silent collaboration between animal, craftsman, and scribe. The symbolic power of parchment beyond its physical qualities. Parchment carried symbolic weight. Because it derived from flesh, it seemed to embody a living connection between body and word. Medieval theologians sometimes drew parallels between parchment and the Incarnation. Just as divine word became flesh in Christ, so too words became flesh in books. Legal systems also recognized parchment's authority. Charters, deeds, and royal proclamations were written on parchment to signal permanence. Paper was for notes and drafts. Parchment was for law and eternity. Even today, some official documents in the United Kingdom Acts of Parliament, for instance, are still enrolled on parchment for symbolic continuity. Survivals in unexpected places. The afterlife of parchment sometimes took odd turns. Sheets from disused books were recycled as bookbindings, pasted into covers, or cut into strips. As a result, fragments of lost texts often appear where one least expects them, glued into the spine of a later volume, hidden beneath leather, or serving as reinforcement in account books. In archives, librarians often discover treasures not by opening a manuscript, but by peeling back the covers. Behind a 16th century ledger might lurk a fragment of Cicero, behind a parish register, a piece of a forgotten liturgy. The parchment handiwork, once discarded, thus becomes a doorway into the past. The decline, but not the end, with the spread of papermaking from the 14th century onward. Parchment gradually declined in everyday use. Paper was cheaper, lighter, and could be produced in vast quantities. By the 15th century, even universities turned increasingly to paper for textbooks. Yet parchment never disappeared. For special documents, charters, diplomas, religious texts, it remained prized. Its tactile strength and aura of permanence gave it a ceremonial role, even after its practical dominance faded. in the modern era. Parchment is still made, though in much smaller quantities, used for calligraphy, diplomas, and Torah scrolls. The continuity is striking. The same techniques of soaking, scraping, and stretching survive, little changed from medieval workshops. The smell of lime, the tension of frames, the rasp of knives, these echoes of the past linger in modern craft. Memory of the forgotten workers. The parchmenter's legacy is not merely in the books that survive, but in the reminder that great cultural achievements depend on humble labor. The names of parchmenters rarely appear in history, but their work forms the very foundation of medieval intellectual life. Every illuminated gospel, every scholastic commentary, every royal charter was once a rawhide in a workshop by a stream. The parchmenter transformed it through patience, skill, and no small amount of physical hardship. The irony is poignant. The parchmenter handled hundreds, perhaps thousands, of sheets, yet left no words of their own. They supplied the stage on which others performed, never stepping into the light themselves. The quiet endurance to read a medieval manuscript is, unknowingly, to touch the labor of a forgotten craftsman. The smooth page beneath the fingertips is not just an artifact, but a survivor of weather, of wars, of changing fashions in writing. The legacy of parchment is endurance. Endurance of material, endurance of memory, endurance of hidden labor. In the stillness of a library, when one gazes at an illuminated page, the silent work of the parchmenter is still there, muted, invisible but essential. And so parchment stands as a paradox, fragile yet strong, humble yet monumental, silent yet filled with echoes. It is both the least noticed and most enduring companion of the written word. Closing reflection. When a parchmenter in a medieval town stretched a calfskin on a wooden frame, they could not have imagined that their work would outlast empires, dynasties, and even the very faiths and philosophies their sheets once carried. Yet, here we are, centuries later, still reading, still studying, still uncovering their traces. Their craft ensured that words would not fade with time, that memory would remain tangible, that silence could become permanence. The legacy of parchment, then, is not only the survival of texts, but the survival of hidden human effort, the anonymous labor that made culture possible. Story 6. Catherine and the religious tensions in France. When Catherine de' Medici became Queen Consort of France through her marriage to Henry II in 1533, no one could have predicted the role she would play in one of Europe's most turbulent religious conflicts. She was Italian by birth, a Medici of Florence, and she arrived in France as a young bride in a court where she was at first overshadowed. But by the mid-16th century, Catherine would become one of the most powerful figures in France, not because of her husband, but because of her children and because of the religious chaos that engulfed the kingdom. To understand Catherine's dilemma, you must picture France in the 1550s and 1560s, a kingdom torn between old faith and new, between Catholic tradition and the spread of Protestant belief. These tensions were not simply theological debates. They were matters of politics, identity, and survival. And they landed squarely in Catherine's lap when she became Queen Mother and Regent. The rise of Protestantism in France. The Protestant Reformation, launched by Martin Luther in 1517 and carried further by John Calvin in the 1530s, found fertile ground in France. Calvin himself was French, born in Noyon, and his writings inspired communities across the kingdom. French Protestants came to be known as Huguenots, and by the middle of the 16th century, they numbered perhaps a tenth of the population, more in some regions, less in others. The Huguenots were not only a religious group, but also a political force. Many nobles, particularly in southern and western France, adopted Protestantism both out of conviction and as a means to challenge royal or Catholic authority. Towns began to divide, one parish Catholic, the next Protestant. Sermons grew heated, and sacred spaces became battlegrounds of identity. For Catherine Boo, who was herself Catholic, the rise of Protestantism posed a grave dilemma. As Queen Mother to young kings, she had to preserve unity. Yet, outright repression threatened rebellion, and unchecked growth threatened Catholic dominance. A kingdom of factions, religious divisions in France intertwined with noble rivalries. The Guise family, powerful Catholic dukes, positioned themselves as defenders of the old faith. Their wealth, military might, and influence at court. The Bourbon family, with ties to Protestant leaders, leaned toward the Huguenots and challenged the Guises, to which Catherine's children belonged, sat precariously between these factions. Her sons Francis II, Charles IX, and later Henry III were kings in name, but too young or too weak to control the realm alone. Catherine became the pivot on which the balance rested. Catherine, as regent after the death of her husband, Henry II, in 1559, Catherine assumed a new role. Francis II, her eldest son, was only 15 when he became king, and he died less than 2 years later. His younger brother, Charles IX, inherited the throne at just 10 years old. Catherine became regent, wielding power in her son's name. Her task was daunting: to guide a child king, to protect the dynasty, and to hold together a kingdom fraying along religious lines. She was pragmatic above all. Catherine did not share the zeal of the Guise family, nor the convictions of Protestant leaders. Her religion was Catholic, but her instinct was survival. She sought compromise, moderation, and the art of balancing. In a world of fanatics, she tried to be a mediator. The problem of tolerance. Catherine soon discovered that tolerance was a dangerous word in the 16th century. To the Catholic majority, allowing Protestants to worship freely was unthinkable. To Protestants, restrictions on worship meant persecution. Every edict, every compromise, pleased no one fully. Her first experiments in tolerance allowed limited Protestant preaching outside city walls. But such measures provoked outrage from Catholic preachers, who thundered from pulpits that the Queen Mother was betraying the faith. Crowds rioted, and violence broke out between neighbors. Catherine saw with growing alarm that France was becoming a tinderbox. Every sermon, every insult, every rumor of conspiracy risked sparking civil war. The Queen's dilemma. Catherine's dilemma was personal as well as political. Her son's very survival depended on stability. A monarchy that lost control of the kingdom could be swept aside by noble factions. And as a foreign-born Queen Mother, Catherine herself was vulnerable to suspicion. She could not afford to favor one side openly, yet neither could she ignore the demands of either. Imagine Catherine in the Louvre Palace, walking through long corridors while letters arrive from across France, reports of Protestant gatherings in the south, Catholic uprisings in the north, rumors of plots against her children. Each day required decisions. It was relentless, and none of her choices promised lasting peace. Early cracks in the crown, the deeper Catherine looked, the more she saw the cracks widening. Town councils refused to enforce royal edicts. Nobles armed their private militias. Preachers on both sides denounced each other in language that left little room for compromise. Catherine tried to hold firm. She summoned assemblies, sought legal solutions, and pressed for moderation. Yet she knew, deep down, that moderation itself was becoming radical. The Queen Mother faced a question that would haunt her for years. Could a divided kingdom ever be united by compromise? Or would compromise itself destroy her? Unresolved ending. As the 1560s began, France stood at the edge of violence. Catherine de' Medici, at the heart of power, balanced precariously between factions. Every choice seemed to invite disaster. Would her strategy of compromise preserve her children's crown, or would it only delay the inevitable explosion? In the mid-16th century, Catherine de' Medici found herself walking a tightrope between competing factions. France was not yet consumed by open war, but the tensions between Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots, were tightening like a rope ready to snap. Section 1 traced the early divisions and Catherine's difficult position as Queen Mother. Now, in Section 2, the story shifts from cautious balance to the unraveling of peace. The fragile Edict of Toleration in 1562. Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, an attempt at compromise that permitted limited Protestant worship. It was a bold move for a Catholic queen in a Catholic kingdom. Her goal was not religious sympathy, but political survival. She needed to prevent civil war, and she recognized that outright repression would drive Protestants to revolt. But compromise satisfied no one. To Catholics, it seemed a dangerous concession. To Protestants, it felt like a half measure. Tension simmered, and before long, it boiled over. The Spark Massacre at Vassillon, March 1st, 1562. Francis, Duke of Guise, a staunch Catholic nobleman, led his men into the town of Vassy there. Protestants were worshipping in a barn legally under Catherine's edict. A quarrel broke out. Stones were thrown, insults shouted. Guise's soldiers retaliated with swords and muskets. When the chaos ended, over 50 Protestants were dead. The massacre of Vassy ignited the First French War of Religion. For Catherine, the massacre was a disaster. Her edict had been undermined in blood, and her authority mocked by one of the most powerful Catholic families. She had tried to hold the balance, but the scale tipped violently. The rise of armed factions in the aftermath. France fractured along religious and political lines. Catholics, led by the powerful Guise family, claimed to defend the old faith and the unity of France. Huguenots, led by figures like Admiral Coligny and the Prince of Conde, rallied for freedom of worship and protection from persecution. Catherine was caught between them. Both sides distrusted her, suspecting she leaned toward the other. Her true aim was survival of her son's fragile monarchy, survival of the crown's authority, survival of France itself. Catherine as mediator. Catherine sought to play the role of mediator, shuttling between factions, arranging talks, and proposing truces. She corresponded tirelessly, summoned councils, and traveled across provinces. Her letters reveal a woman exasperated by fanaticism, pleading for moderation in an age that rejected it. But mediation required trust, and Catherine had little. Each concession she offered was twisted against her. To Protestants, she seemed too Catholic. To Catholics, she seemed too indulgent. Still, she pressed on, for she had little choice. France's survival depended on her balancing act. The First Civil War, the war that followed Vassy, was brutal. Armies marched across France, towns shifted allegiance, and sieges dragged on. Iconoclasm spread, Protestants destroyed statues and altars, while Catholics retaliated with executions and expulsions. Catherine attempted to restrain her young son, Charles IX, who was king in name but still a boy in practice. She feared he would be swept up by factional leaders. To keep him neutral, she moved the royal court constantly, never allowing him to fall fully under Catholic or Protestant sway. Her strategy was mobility, the monarchy as a wandering presence, avoiding capture by either side. It was exhausting, but perhaps necessary. The cost of compromised peace came in 1563 with the Edict of Amboise, another attempt at limited toleration. But by then, mistrust had deepened. The war had hardened identities. To be Catholic or Protestant in France was no longer just a matter of belief, was political, communal, even existential. Catherine's compromises bought time, but not resolution. Each edict seemed like a truce before the next storm, and storms kept coming. The growing shadow of the Guise and Bourbon rivalries. The wars were not purely about religion. They were also about noble rivalry. The Guise family, Catholic champions, sought influence over the throne. The Bourbons' Protestant allies hoped to strengthen their own power. For Catherine, these noble rivalries were as dangerous as the religious divide. If one family dominated, her sons would be reduced to pawns. She needed to keep both sides checked. Even as she tried to protect her children's fragile reign, Charles IX, and the burden of kingship as her son, Charles IX, grew older. Catherine faced another challenge: how to shape him into a king strong enough to hold a divided realm. Charles was impressionable, torn between advisors. Sometimes he leaned toward Protestant counsel, sometimes toward Catholic zeal that Catherine tried to instill in him, caution and patience. But Charles's youthful impulsiveness worried her. He could be swayed by those who shouted loudest, and in a France filled with shouting, that was a dangerous trait. The thin line between peace and chaos by the mid-1560s. Catherine's France was a land of unease. On the surface, there was peace, treaties signed, parades held, marriages arranged between noble families. Yet beneath the surface lay suspicion, hatred, and fear. Every church bell, every rumor of conspiracy, every movement of armed men risked plunging the kingdom back into violence. Catherine's edicts were fragile paper walls against a storm that grew louder with each passing year. The Queen Mother remained determined, but the cost of compromise was mounting. She had preserved her son's throne for now, but at what price? Each peace seemed weaker than the last, and each war bloodier. Unresolved ending as the 1560s drew to a close. Catherine faced a pressing question. How long could compromise hold when both sides increasingly believed compromise itself was betrayal? The First War had ended, but it was only the beginning. The next eruption was already forming, and Catherine knew it. Would she find a way to preserve unity, or would France slide irreversibly into chaos? The uneasy balance Catherine de' Medici had worked so hard to preserve began to collapse in the late 1560s and early 1570s. For more than a decade, she had pursued the difficult role of mediator, neither wholly Catholic nor Protestant, but a queen mother dedicated to her children's survival and the monarchy's stability. Yet, as France lurched from one fragile peace to another, the space for compromise narrowed. By 1572, that narrow space gave way to an eruption of violence that would become infamous: the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Marriages as diplomacy. Catherine's tool of choice for diplomacy was the marriage alliance. She understood that if swords could not bind France, perhaps family ties could. Her most ambitious plan was to marry her daughter, Marguerite of Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant of the Bourbon family. This match was bold. To Catholics, it was nearly unthinkable: a Catholic princess bound to a Protestant prince. To Protestants, it was a sign of hope that the royal family might acknowledge their place in France. Catherine believed the union might knit together the fractured kingdom, binding Bourbon and Valois, Protestant and Catholic. The wedding was scheduled for August 1572 in Paris. Guests from across France and Europe would attend. It was a chance for Catherine to stage a grand display of unity. But unity was fragile, and beneath the glitter of the court, resentment festered. The Protestant presence in Paris for the marriage. Thousands of Huguenot nobles and followers poured into Paris. The city was overwhelmingly Catholic, its people resentful of Protestant worship and suspicious of outsiders. The streets grew tense. Taverns filled with mutterings of plots. Priests preached against heresy from pulpits in the Louvre Palace. Catherine tried to keep order, but outside the walls, the mood was sour. Too many Parisians, the presence of so many Protestants in their city, felt like an invasion. The wedding that was meant to symbolize reconciliation became a spark of unease. The attempt on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the most influential Protestant leaders, attended the wedding. He was respected for his military skill and known for his loyalty to the Protestant cause. Catherine and Charles IX, her son, the king, had cautiously courted his counsel. But Coligny had enemies, many of them. Only days after the wedding, an assassin fired upon him as he walked through the streets, wounding him but not killing him. Suspicion spread instantly. Was it the work of the Guise family? Was Catherine herself involved? The attack deepened mistrust. Protestant nobles gathered in Paris, demanded justice. Catholic leaders whispered of conspiracy. The city's air grew heavier with fear. The turning point. Catherine's dilemma. Catherine found herself once again in the center of a storm. If she protected Coligny and pursued the attackers, she risked enraging Catholic hardliners. If she failed to act, she would alienate the Protestant leaders gathered in Paris, some accounts suggest. Catherine feared Coligny's growing influence over her son, Charles IX. The admiral had advised intervention in the Netherlands against Spain. Costly war, Catherine dreaded, whether out of fear of Coligny's power, fear of Protestant retaliation, or desperation to control events. Catherine and her advisors moved toward a drastic choice. The massacre begins in the early hours of August 24th, 1572. St. Bartholomew's, Dathobel of Saint Germain, Loxoa Church, told. Under cover of darkness, Catholic forces struck. First, Coligny was killed in his bed, his body thrown from a window. Then, violence spread through Paris. Houses were marked, doors forced open, families dragged into the streets. Swords and pikes cut down men, women, and children. Blood stained the cobblestones. The massacre did not end with Paris. News spread, and in towns across France, Catholic mobs attacked Protestants. Thousands perished in the following weeks. Charles IX and Catherine's Rolda massacre shocked Europe. To Protestants, it was evidence of Catholic treachery. To Catholics, it was portrayed as divine justice. Charles IX claimed the massacre was his decision, declaring he wished to eliminate conspirators who threatened the crown. Yet most historians believe Catherine played a crucial role, whether in planning or simply permitting the violence to unfold once it began. Her motives remain debated. Was she orchestrating the killings to secure her son's reign? Was she panicked by rumors of a Protestant uprising? Or was she swept along by forces beyond her control, trapped by circumstances she could no longer manage? Aftermath and consequences. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre destroyed any illusion of trust between Catholics and Protestants. What had been a fragile balance collapsed into open hatred. Henry of Navarre, the new Protestant groom, survived only by converting temporarily to Catholicism. The wars of religion reignited with fresh fury, dragging on for decades. Catherine's dream of uniting her kingdom through compromise lay in ruins. Her reputation, too, was scarred. Too many Protestants, she became the embodiment of cruelty and cunning, remembered as the Poison Queen. To Catholics, she was both respected and feared, a woman who wielded power but could not deliver lasting peace. The weight of legacy of a massacre marked the high point of religious tension in France under Catherine's rule. Though she continued to govern, negotiate, and arrange alliances, her credibility as mediator was shattered. France would endure more wars before stability returned under Henry IV, the very groom whose wedding had been overshadowed by bloodshed. Catherine's legacy is tangled. Was she a ruthless schemer, orchestrating violence, or a desperate mother and regent, making impossible choices in a fractured kingdom? History offers no simple answer. What is clear is that she embodied the complexity of her age, torn between faiths, rivalries, and the survival of her family. Her story reveals the limits of compromise in a time when people believed compromise itself was betrayal. Closing reflection. As we look back, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands not only as a tragedy of faith, but also as a reminder of the fragile line between peace and chaos. Catherine de' Medici tried for years to walk that line, balancing factions, writing edicts, arranging marriages. Yet, in the end, the storm proved stronger than her balance. The massacre was her greatest failure, and yet also a testament to the impossible position she held. To judge her is to confront the brutal choices of a world where every path was lined with blood. If tonight's story helped you rest, there are always more forgotten corners of the past waiting to be told. Until next time, may the calm of history stay with you. Asterisk.